Chapter 495. 27 women, more than 30 children, and more than 10 craftsmen. As slaves, this would be a great fortune. For the swift sword mercenary group that had already fallen to become a group of bandits, this was a rare harvest. Contrary to what some people had guessed, the swift sword mercenary group that was wreaking havoc around the new Night Lord wasn't a group of bandits that had been formed on the spot. Their previous incarnation was the swift sword warriors mercenary group that the rebellious Marquis had hired. For a mercenary group, it was a rare opportunity to be recruited by a great lord. The mercenary group itself would receive official support and supplies, while the ordinary members would receive generous rewards and promotion opportunities. And for the higher-ups, this was the only chance for them to become nobles. There was no lack of ambitious mercenaries among the modeled mercenaries. As long as they were given enough rewards, mercenaries who were originally outlaws would be able to take off anyone's head, including their own. Countless strong mercenaries would be tempted by the opportunity to have themselves and their descendants become high and mighty nobles. However, a great lord wouldn't casually throw away the opportunity to recruit them. If a new noble wanted a territory, it would be the same as cutting off his own flesh. And even if the new noble didn't have a territory, he would still have to give his retainers the same value. You wanted to obtain a noble title? Sure, you could fight with your life on the line. As long as you could prove your strength on the battlefield and obtain enough merits, it would be possible for you to obtain the Great Lord's recognition. Note that the prerequisite for this was that the large mercenary groups would be able to obtain enough merits, maintain their organization, and maintain at least 80% of their combat strength. After all, the great nobles weren't philanthropists. Even if you made great contributions, once you lost your own value, it would be meaningless. On the other hand, a mercenary group that had suffered heavy losses was very suitable for recycling. Ordinary members could at least become qualified private soldiers, and it would be quite cheap to hire powerful individuals who didn't have a strong team. This was the voluntary, free, cannon fodder that the nobles loved the most. Thus, war, a pure and dangerous war, was not a mission that ordinary mercenaries were willing to participate in. After all, when the rewards were high, it also meant that the risks were extremely high. However, everyone knew that the world had no lack of ambitious people and gamblers who thought that they were the only lucky ones. As long as there was war, there would be vultures and hyenas chasing after it. The major lords indeed loved to temporarily hire mercenary groups. Although more than 70% of these mercenary groups were used and discarded pawns, there were rare cases of mercenary groups that were lucky enough to become nobles and regular armies. This encouraged even more mercenary groups to fly like moths to a flame. The original Swift Blade Brave Squad was one of the lucky ones. He had successfully achieved an astonishing amount of military merits, but the leader, Entelai, is dead. Our achievements are gone, and so is the Swift Blade Warriors. A few of our brothers have been hung on the flagpole. Only the vice leader, Khan, has become a noble knight. Brother Schenker said that it was Khan who betrayed us and used the lives of our brothers to exchange for wealth and honor. So, we came to find Khan for revenge. By killing civilians. That's just Khan's property. We plan to sell more and at least get our share back. The citizens are the personal wealth of the Lord? In a sense, this was also a mainstream concept in this world. The two sentries of the Swift Blade Brave Squad were lying together. One of them couldn't move at all, while the other was calmly describing their righteous revenge in front of me. To be able to say these things without a change in his expression, it wasn't because his mental fortitude was great. It was because his soul was collapsing, and he was unable to prevent the information from being leaked. Retracting my index finger from the forehead of the sentries, the black mist began to dissipate. The black pupils had already lost their focus, and what followed was the soul of this weakling dissipating. Even though he still had breath and warmth, he was already a living dead man. When I placed my index finger on the face of the other sentries, the young face was distorted by fear. Cold sweat frantically dripped down, and the yellow liquid that came out from his body made me furrow my eyebrows. But the ugly state of the other party made me lose the intention to verify the information. The stench even made me lose interest in his corpse. With a snap of my fingers, the partial suffocation caused the sentries to turn into a dried corpse in fear. The fatal binding made even the most common pleas for help by the neck become an extravagant hope. The only signs of resistance were the bloody scratches left by his fingernails on the ground. It had been a long time since I acted as an evil undead mage, so it was a good thing that I wasn't out of practice. However, the changes in my companions behind me were quite obvious. The scattered mercenaries, led by the dwarf brothers, had rather ugly expressions, but they were mostly filled with respect and fear. It was one thing to know that someone was powerful, but it was another to be vicious and merciless. I had the same smile as before on my face, but I was quite satisfied. At least in the short term, the negative effects of my loss of moral integrity in the past could be ignored. For mercenaries, a powerful and cruel undead mage wasn't easy to fool. As their employer, my orders should be carried out. Meanwhile, old Barton's old companion, Winston, had an ugly expression and was fiddling with something. An evil undead mage? Why didn't the holy light kill him? Even without lip-reading, I could guess what he was thinking. After all, this old fellow could be considered a traditional believer of the holy light who went to church twice a week. However, the one with the biggest reaction was probably Catalina. She hid behind her adopted father with a pale face, biting her lips tightly. Her eyes couldn't help but wander, not even daring to look at the corpses that had died horribly. My expression didn't change, but I sighed in my heart. "You've made up your mind?" Directly cut off the seeds to prevent the little girl from sinking too deep. "That's a wise choice." The silly cat's voice of Schadenfreude sounded in my ear. The pure joy and malice in her voice were undisguised. It seemed that this silly cat was also a member of the FFF. However, I shook my head. "Don't think too much about it. I'm just using the most suitable method to obtain information. I'm an undead mage now. I don't use undead magic, so why would I use torture?" As for the northern trio, the two veterans didn't seem to care at all. However, the goblin Thor had a face full of hesitation. If it weren't for the fact that the situation was so unsuitable, he would probably have taken out his tool manual and started furiously flipping through it like usual. Is it correct for us to attack these people? Don't misunderstand. The red light from the judgment spell had already sentenced the two sentries to death. What Thor was doubting was the truth that they had stated. Hearing this, I couldn't help but laugh. This Thor was too inexperienced. It was fine if he had doubts in his heart, but he actually accidentally asked about it. Not to mention, he even asked an undead mage. But if everything is true, they have a reason to take revenge. Take revenge on the person themselves. What does it have to do with the innocent villagers? Oh, you probably think that the citizens are the domain lord's wealth, and that taking their wealth is also a form of revenge. Thor fell silent. It seemed that he also agreed with the traditional view that the citizens were the domain lord's wealth. I also fell into deep thought. Sometimes, this thing called tradition was really annoying. Even if it seemed absurd and unreasonable to me, if the majority of people agreed with it, then even if it was fake, it would become true. Even if it was illogical, it would become an ironclad law. The other hidden meaning of this tradition was that nobles had a higher status than commoners. People weren't equal. If I wanted to prove that this traditional view was wrong, it would be the same as declaring that everyone was equal. In this era of feudal royalty, doing so would be suicidal. And in this cruel world where wind and rain swayed, people believed that bloody revenge was a person's most basic right. It was far more righteous than any law. It was just like how in the cruel world of wuxia novels, it was only natural for a son to take revenge on his father. The only right to enforce the law required the support of the only political power. If someone said that only those in the legal profession could carry out the death penalty, that person would be treated as a joke. Proving a tradition to be wrong wasn't something that could be done in a short period of time, let alone two. So, I decided to first bypass the tradition. Are they guilty? Yes, the judgment spell and their testimony proved that they were guilty. Do they deserve to die? Damn it, not only did they carry out a massacre, they also carried out kidnappings, human trafficking, and other crimes. All of these add up to a capital offense. Then it's not wrong to execute them now, right? Don't interrupt me. I know you want to say that they have the freedom to take revenge. But that doesn't mean that they shouldn't be punished for their crimes, right? Yes, but this is this and that is that. This crime and that crime are counted separately. Since there's nothing wrong with the one in front of us, let's deal with the one in front of us first before we have time to deal with the next one. These bandits deserve to die, so let them die. If the domain lord is guilty, you can put him on trial again. Saul came to a sudden realization. With a face full of excitement, he began taking out his notebook to take note. The others were astonished that the stubborn law profession could actually be persuaded. Even the dark elf anti-knight, who always had a cold expression on his face, revealed a slightly surprised expression. Meanwhile, I was secretly grumbling in my heart. Looking at this little idiot, my habit of teaching suddenly came back. I hoped that no one would see through it. Wait, something isn't right. Looking at those bandits who were still staring at our virtual image and drooling, I suddenly felt that something wasn't right. Did the Swift Sword Gang discover us? No, don't you think it's strange? Why are they waiting here with these burdensome captives? Aren't they afraid of being discovered by the domain lord? Just now, that sentinel said that he wanted to sell some captives for money. This isn't a transaction that ordinary merchants can accept. There aren't any professional slave traders around, and most transactions are done face-to-face, which means that they're waiting for the other party to make a deal with. Not only that, attacking a village will result in the domain lord's encirclement. This is a serious crime that even bandits don't dare to do. Since they were confident in exchanging the villagers for money from the very beginning, it's highly likely that they were hired by someone to collect captive. And who is the one that needs captives the most right now? It's the Death Council that desperately needs sacrifices. Perhaps there will be clues about those evil cultists. No, such an important sacrifice should be personally taken by the higher-ups of the Death Council. When the silly cat and I came to an agreement, we looked at those bandits with greed in our eyes, as if we were looking at delicious fat sheep. Chapter 496. The affairs of the world truly are unpredictable. Ominous magic surged out from the shadows. After being infused with actual evil intent, the magic transformed into a black mist that contained the power of Hades and the power of death. The black mist gathered, circled, and compressed above my finger, forming a tangible ominous light. Kill him. Don't let him cast this spell. Just the magic that was spreading out from my finger mixed with the black mist and transformed into a roaring skull. The spell hadn't even taken form yet, but it already had such power. This was far beyond the comprehension of ordinary people. Even without the Swift Sword Gang's leader giving any orders, even ordinary bandits would know what to do after witnessing such a frightening scene. The tall one-eyed archer swiftly picked up his bow and arrows. The armed bandits didn't say anything else and roared as they charged forward. There was even a sly fellow who directly used a captive as his meat shield. At the moment of life and death, everyone made their choice, but I could only silently sigh. Although life is unpredictable, at least everyone is equal in the face of death. Open, gate of Hades. The black light gathered together, and the black mist of the skull roared behind him. It was as if some sort of gate from another world had been opened. It was evident that the spell was almost complete. The aura of death spread out, and the cowardly bandits were so frightened that they dropped their weapons. Even the fierce bandits had twisted expressions of fear. They could already smell the scent of death. Only the one-eyed bandit leader kept focusing on aiming. He knew that he only had one chance against this archmage who had suddenly appeared. If he missed this chance, he would never be able to survive against such an opponent again. Pa. At the same time that my ears couldn't hear the twang of the bowstring, the enchanted mithril arrowhead arrived in front of me. The bowstring broke through the speed of sound. This ranger had most likely broken through to the legend rank. Cat shield. With just a thought, the owner of the magical pet gave the command. A white cat jumped out from the shadows and happened to block the arrow. However, judging from the cat's displeased glare, it didn't seem like it was willing to do so. Still, magical pets were meant to block arrows. Damn it! Seeing that his attack had been blocked by a cat, the former ranger captain of the Swift Blade Warriors, who was now the boss of the bandit group Swift Blade, the one-eyed Eagleshink, had a look of disbelief on his face. He knew the power of his arrows. Those were piercing arrows that could shatter heavy armor. Even if they were blocked by a human body, they could still pierce through a meat shield and kill the vulnerable mage behind them. The tail of the arrow was still on the cat's body, but the arrowhead had disappeared without a trace. Then, the place where the arrow hit the cat twisted, and the wound on its body turned into a big gulp. In the end, the precious mithril exorcism arrow disappeared without a trace. However, the facts in front of him forced him to admit that the heavy arrow that could pierce through rocks had mysteriously disappeared into the body of that ordinary house cat. The white cat even burped as if it had eaten some delicious food. Monster! Schenker's judgment was not wrong. The house cat in front of him was indeed a monster disguised as a cat, but as soon as he spoke, the cat's vertical beast eyes stared at him. Monster, the same words had been spoken out of anger a moment ago, but now they were spoken out of fear and helplessness. With just one glance, he felt as if he had been devoured by a ferocious beast. His back was soaked in cold sweat. He had experienced countless battles, but he had never felt so close to death. How many people must have been killed to accumulate this kind of killing intent? This was definitely not a monster that he could deal with. Escape? No, I can't give up on these last brothers, but if I don't escape, I'll only. The bandit boss was still struggling with himself. The 6-circle death spell, Gate of Hades, had already been completed, but it still made him make a decision. The next moment, however, a flying elf was born from it. The palm-sized black elf giggled in the sky, leaving behind black fog and bell-like giggles wherever she went. Hee. The magic condensed elf was like a living creature. Her transparent wings were no longer flapping, and black gem dust was constantly falling from them. She flew in the sky for a while, leaving behind a man-made, brilliant galaxy. Suddenly, she glided down and passed by the bandit. Even the blades couldn't stop her giggles. It seemed that she was playing around. The spell failed? That black-robed mage isn't an enemy? The bandits were just rejoicing when the situation suddenly changed again. Gate of Hades, open up. The elf giggled in the sky. Her soft and strange voice allowed everyone to understand the meaning of her strange language. Suddenly, the elf's entire body exploded and transformed back into black fog. The black fog transformed back into a crazily laughing skull, but this time, it was more than 3 meters tall and seemed real. The skull's eyes seemed to be smiling, and its huge mouth seemed to be devouring light like a black hole. That was the Gate of Hades, a dark abyss that devoured souls. The bandits had just been playing with the elf, but in the next moment they all collapsed to the ground. Their eyes were still wide open, but there was no focus in them. That was because they had lost their souls. As if it had discovered that it no longer had any food, the skull's door closed once again. This time, it transformed back into the elf, which then giggled at me before vanishing. This spell is truly filled with evil intent. Is it your interest? No, I simply constructed the spell's model based on the principles behind it. I don't know why it became like this. Perhaps the power of Hades itself is special, or perhaps the gods of the Hades faction that this spell borrowed power from have such evil interests to begin with. Death Magic, Gate of Hades. If you analyzed its magic model, you would find that it wasn't actually any difficult spell. It was simply a spell that connected Hades, opened up a hole, and used the power of the Hades within to attack the enemy. Or, to put it more directly, it was a spell that stole the souls of mortals. It was obvious that this was a spell that required the gods' approval. It was a new type of spell that was somewhere between divine arts and magic. However, in terms of principles, it was the same as before. The Order God's divine arts included the light of heaven, while the Chaos Demon's divine arts included the reign of chaos. The former was used to open up a dimensional door to the higher planes, using the positive energy of the higher planes to attack the undead, demons, and other creatures. The latter was the exact opposite. The power of chaos in the lower planes was effective against all mortal creatures, and it even had additional effects against creatures of order like angels. However, the same magic's principles were completely different when it came to the Hades faction. First of all, the lowest-ranked Light of Heaven was only a 3-circle divine art, while the Gate of Hades was between the 6-circle and 7-circle difficult to cast. It was already a Legend's specialty. However, the huge cost of casting it also had an even more outstanding effect. Judging from the magic's principles, this was an AoE spell with a high chance of instant death. I nodded in satisfaction as I looked at the pile of bandits' corpses in front of me. The effects were even better than I had expected. It would seem that the spell model for this spell could finally be finalized. After that, I would hand it over to the magic country for safekeeping. The Order gods had their own divine art. Holy Light was a type of positive energy, which was the most natural support for the Order faction. Originally, the power of death was purely negative energy. However, after the Hades were created, the power of death gained the concepts of judgment, death, reincarnation, and atonement. It became a brand new type of energy, the power of Hades. We're fine? The villagers who were also within the spell's range discovered to their astonishment that they were completely unharmed. They were delighted to discover that the bandits around them had all collapsed. In the past, the power of death was like a berserk waterfall. It had tremendous destructive power but was uncontrollable. Meanwhile, the power of Hades was like the quietly flowing river Styx. Although it seemed calm, it contained a threat that could even kill angels. However, as long as it was in accordance with the natural laws, it would be harmless and could be guided. The flowing silver sand swirled in my hands. The black stars within the sand were as resplendent as gemstones. The power of Hades had evolved from the power of death. Following the reconnection between the Hades and the He plane, the power of Hades had become one of the most basic natural laws of this world. Countless mages and priests, especially necromancers and evil god priests, were researching this new power. In my case, this new gold-ranked power, known as the Emissary of Hades, was almost mature enough to be popularized. Take note, although the power of Hades was an evolution of the power of death, priests and normal mages could also learn and master it. The former would establish a connection with the gods of Hades, while the latter would have to interact with the natural laws of Hades. However, there was no need for them to become necromancers who were filled with negative energy. The powerful might of a new magic was the best calling card. Even though there weren't many researchers working on it, there were already more than 30 new types of magic in the Hades spell catalog. Among them, there were quite a few that were destined to leave their names in history. However, only 2 of them were personally created by me. You have the cheek to say that? If it wasn't for me, you would only be able to complete this spell after another 10 years. Alright, I have to admit that the darned cat who was glaring at me right now had better talent in magic than me. Not only did she invent 7 of them, I also had my 2 spell models thanks to her help. As for how to kill the bandits without harming the villagers? The red light on the corpses and the judge soul who was currently helping the villagers was the reason. Law incantation, judgment. Originally, this spell could only be used in conjunction with law incantations to increase its power. However, since the god of law and the ruler of Hades were of the same family, the powers of these two systems were actually able to stack together. The power of Hades itself had the concept of judging sinners. Right now, through judgment, it was able to pinpoint the location of the most recent crime, which also served as a marker. If it wasn't for judgment's pinpointing location, it would probably be an instant death magic test. This was a test of one's life and will. Before the power of Hades ran out, I didn't know if the bandits would be able to all die, but the villagers definitely wouldn't be able to survive. Right now, the white light that represented the innocent was their strongest fortress. If the power of law is a protective shield, then the new divine arts and magic, created by the power of Hades, would probably be the best weapons. After testing the results of the spell, I discovered to my astonishment that one of the bandits actually didn't die. Although the one-eyed man with the bow was only breathing out and not in, I seemed to have a decent experimental subject. Chapter 497. Con Stark was one of the high-ranking members of the brave Swift Sword mercenary group. His nickname was White Eagle Knight. Unlike other grassroots mercenaries who didn't even have a surname, Stark was once a very famous local noble. However, by Con's grandfather's generation, he had already fallen from grace. Even Con had to borrow money from his distant relatives to study and practice martial art. The white eagle emblem with its wings spread high in the sky was a noble emblem that had already lost all meaning. It was also a great mockery of the unfilial descendants of meritorious nobles. Con had grown up listening to his ancestors' heroic stories, but what awaited him was the reality that his family was destitute. Apart from his ancestral martial arts and armor, he had almost nothing. It was far too common for a knight whose family had fallen from grace to become a mercenary. There was a 99% chance that he would die in some random alley. However, Con was different. He had been intelligent ever since he was young, and he had set great ambitions. While other mercenaries were living a befuddled life, he was working hard to revive his family. He didn't die on the battlefield, and he always led the charge. Before he was 40, he had already gone from an ordinary mercenary to a legend rank knight. His reputation had spread far and wide. He was forthright, decisive, and enthusiastic about helping others. He had a high reputation in the mercenary group, and he was also a high-ranking member in charge of diplomatic affairs. He had even personally arranged for the rebellious Marquis to join in this civil war. It was said that he was the next leader of the mercenary group. It could be said that he was at the peak of his life. He was the template for an ordinary person to turn over a new leaf. However, the old mercenary group leader, who had always treated Con as his own son, didn't know that in Stark's eyes, this mercenary group, which he viewed as his family, was a stepping stone for his family to return to the circle of nobles, even though it was a stain on his ancestors' reputation. And then, actually, the process wasn't important at all. It was just a series of betrayals and conspiracies. Since there was a motive and the ability to plan a rebellion, one only needed to look at the results to know what a successful schemer or ambitious schemer had done. The Swift Sword group, which had been on the rebel army's side, was almost completely annihilated, while he himself had become a Knight Lord of the Kingdom's side, completing the transition from a rebel to a legitimate noble. In an instant, he had achieved his life's goal and once again used the White Eagle emblem and war flag that had been passed down in his family for generations. However, Stark, who seemed to have reached the pinnacle of his life, was currently filled with vexation. It wasn't that he had just received a warning about a small village in his territory being attacked, as there were far too many such incidents. The villagers in remote areas were all poor people who couldn't afford to pay taxes, so even if they were fed to wild beasts, they wouldn't suffer much. What he was truly vexed about was the special envoy before him, Prince Link, the second son of Archduke Sala. The younger prince's older brother was currently at war with Marquis Stanley. It was rumored that this younger prince had previously studied in the Mage country. Although he had just turned 20 years old, he was quite famous in the capital's academic and magical circles. His arrival as a special envoy was rather sudden, and he was accompanied by the kingdom's most elite Boulder Heavy Infantry squad. The moment he spoke, he asked for the map of Karn's territory and the latest information, and he even wanted Karn to summon all his warriors. It was obvious that something important was going on. On one side was a noble member of the royal family, who had the kingdom's most elite army, while on the other side was a small knight lord. Even the militia only numbered less than 100. The younger prince didn't need to explain anything to Con Stark. Con could only do as Link said. Could it be that he's here for the treasure map? Stark's heart was pounding. The reason why he had chosen this border area was because of an ancient treasure map left behind by his family. The location of the treasure was in the nearby mountain range, and the only mountain path leading to and from the mountain range was in this territory. Why didn't he directly go and retrieve the treasure? It was rumored that the ruins were guarded by extremely strong guards. This wasn't something that could be taken care of in a short period of time. Originally, Stark had intended to develop his territory and establish his own private army before thinking about stealing the treasure. That's impossible, that's impossible. I've hidden that map very well. He had always kept that treasure map close to his body. After all, it was related to his endless wealth and great power in slumber. It was his greatest reliance on reviving his family. Stark kept comforting himself, but when he entered Prince Link's temporary command center, he almost couldn't hide his panic. What was pasted on the wall was an enlarged version of the map that had been passed down to him by his ancestors. The familiar markings of the ruins were at the place that had left the deepest impression on him. Their destination is our grandfather's inheritance? How is that possible? Who leaked my family's secret? At that time, I saw Con always fiddling around in his tent. Boss was afraid that something would go wrong, so he had me investigate him. That was how I found this treasure map. Treasure map? No, this was just an ordinary map of the base. The markings and words on it only explained the purpose of this base's factory. Endless wealth and great power in slumber? Only true scholars would be able to decipher the words of the Halettim generation. Just the vague description alone was enough to tell that it was a prophecy magic spell. That's a research base of the Halettim generation. The secrets of knowledge and technology are endless wealth and power to begin with. It's completely understandable that a prophecy magic spell would give such an answer. The parchment that I had obtained from Shink was incredibly tattered. However, the lines drawn on the parchment were still quite clear. This was a hand-copied map. Considering that many rangers were also experts in scouting and drawing, Shink's words were quite trustworthy. How many people know about this map? Did the Death Council obtain this map from you? I had already confirmed that the bandit group in front of me did indeed have business dealings with the Death Council. In that case, the Death Council was probably able to find the ruins because of me. In that case, my information would be even more valuable. Although Shink had survived the Door of Hades, he was still incredibly weak. In my eyes, his weak soulfire was just like a candle in the wind, about to be extinguished at any moment. In his current state, it was impossible for Shink to stop my search. A simple suggestion spell was all it took for him to tell me everything he knew. However, I was worried that he would suddenly die when I saw the ranger collapsing on the ground, so I sent him a sliver of holy light. His complexion improved slightly, but his soulfire was still about to be extinguished at any moment. That was because holy light was unable to heal the soul. However, the improved physical strength allowed him to at least tell me some information. After that bastard betrayed me, I directly sold this map to more than 10 merchant guilds and mercenary groups. I wanted everyone to know Con Stark's password. I wanted everyone to steal his treasures. I wanted him to experience what it felt like to have something he loved stolen away. Even though Shink was under my control, the hatred in his tone was quite obvious. When he said Khan's name, his lifeless eyes suddenly regained their vigor. If it wasn't for the fact that I immediately increased my control over him, he probably would have broken free already. If word spread like wildfire, wouldn't it become a secret that everyone in the country would know? I couldn't help but laugh when I heard this, but then I became rather annoyed. From Shink's perspective, this was indeed the best way to take revenge. Revealing such wealth would only attract villains with evil intentions. As long as information about Khan Stark's treasure was leaked, the chances of Khan Stark obtaining the treasure would naturally be greatly reduced. However, from my perspective, it would be fine if it was only an adventuring team that wanted to steal the treasure. A treasure location that didn't have a legend behind it would most likely be a waste of effort. Veteran adventurers wouldn't even consider it. However, if the information spread far and wide, there would inevitably be people who would recognize the treasure. If the Haletum generation's ruins attracted the attention of large factions, that would be a huge problem. The internal war will only happen this year. It won't take more than 6 months for the information to be leaked. The foreign factions won't be able to arrive in time. However, the longer we delay, the more unexpected things will happen. We need to speed things up. After dealing with official matters, it was now time for personal matters. I was quite curious as to why Shink was able to survive my Door of Hades. Based on the information I already knew, it was no coincidence that Shink was able to survive my Door of Hades. Death magic that could cause instant death would need to be countered by the target's resistances. Death magic created from negative energy would attack both the physical body and the soul. However, it would mainly attack the physical body. The Door of Hades naturally had the ability to forcefully control souls. This type of forceful control wasn't something that an ordinary physical body would be able to defend against. In that case, the only thing that could resist against the Door of Hades was the strength of one's soul, which was the stat that my system categorized as willpower. Strength 14, Agility 22, Constitution 14, Intelligence 12, Willpower 14, Revenge Oath plus 4, for a total of 18, Charm 12. He's quite a good material. Hatred was the catalyst for willpower. Shink, who swore to take revenge, used bitter practices to torment himself. The pain from his training also seemed to strengthen his soul's strength. His desire for revenge and his indestructible soul allowed him to survive the Door of Hades's soul-stealing ability. However, his soul was like a dying flame in the wind, which proved that he wouldn't be able to live for long. That's nothing. For us, life itself is meaningless. The soul is everything. That's right. For an undead mage, a powerful soul filled with hatred would be an irresistible temptation. Plus, a physical body would be an even better combination. I opened my arms, and the black mist that represented death transformed into a blooming black rose. The aura of death caused Shink to tremble and wake up. If I leave you alone, you'll die soon. Perhaps your corpse will be torn apart by the villagers you attacked to vent their hatred. However, I have a contract here. If you agree, not only will you be able to continue living in a different way, I'll even grant you the ability to take revenge. The ability to take revenge on the bastard who betrayed you. How did he choose? This wasn't a choice to begin with. His decision was made from the very start due to his deep-rooted hatred for the Door of Hades. I agree. As long as I can take revenge, I'm willing to do anything. On the other side, as I watched the people busy rescuing the villagers, I began to plan. Originally, this was just a vacation to relax. But now, it seems that not only will there be other competitors, the ruins' defense system will also be quite dangerous. Perhaps I'll need some additional combat strength. Chapter 498. Actually, at first, I wanted to be a swordsman who wore clothes as white as snow and came and went like the wind. But then, where did I go wrong? Why did my style become like this? The mage robe I bought from the town didn't even have any magic enchantments on it. It had almost zero defensive capabilities, and it didn't even have any magic buff. It was quite uncomfortable to wear. The only use of this cheap black mage robe was probably to show off my identity as an evil undead mage. But the effect was so good that I didn't know what to say. TSK, TSK, this crying sounds like I'm about to go to a slaughterhouse. Perhaps it was because I had been too vicious with my attacks, or perhaps it was because Shink was screaming too pitifully during my transformation into an undead, but even though I was the one who saved him, the villagers all looked at me in fear. Some women and children were even crying, as if they themselves had suffered an even worse fate. Right now, apart from sighing at how terrible the reputation of undead mages was, I could only complain about how wrong the style was. A swordsman who wears snow-white clothes? Isn't that just cannon fodder? Your original goal in life was to become cannon fodder. Wait a moment, how could a white-clothed swordsman be cannon fodder? The silly cat's comment made me feel like something was wrong. What was wrong with the image of a swordsman in my mind? Cannon fodder? A large number of people are equipped with single-handed swords and two-handed swords, but they don't wear armor. Only the slaves who are brought here are given the cheapest and simplest longswords and two-handed swords, along with wooden shields and helmets to block arrows, forcing them to become cannon fodder. An unenchanted blunt sword won't even be able to cut through chain armor, and without armor, they'll just be easy targets for the enemy to kill. What else can they be other than cannon fodder? The silly cat seemed to be going crazy, and I had somewhat grasped the pattern. It seemed that every time I used undead magic or achieved a breakthrough in my snake magic, she would become more and more excited, as if this was proof of her teacher's power level. Based on my many years of experience, any militia that has received some basic training on the battlefield will carry a bamboo pole as a spear. At the very least, it has a longer attack range and a higher chance of survival on the battlefield. Only the cannon fodder that's forced to use up the enemy's stamina and magic power will only be given a single-handed sword and sent to the battlefield. Although I knew that she was trying to attack me maliciously, if I thought about it carefully, based on the common sense of this world, what she said was indeed the truth. In modern cities, the advancement of chemical industry had made clothing colors extremely common. However, in the Middle Ages, dyes could only be extracted from minerals and plants, which was rather troublesome. In the world of Aichi, the technology in this area had just sprouted and was monopolized by the alchemists, who used it for huge profits. Although the dye technology was now in the hands of merchants and the price of the dye was not too expensive, it was still an expense. The clothes of the nobles were always colorful and gorgeous. The colorful animals and mythical patterns were not only decorations, but also symbols of their race and status. Even the big merchants would always wear colorful clothes to show off their wealth. Even the commoners would wear colorful clothes during festivals. Only the poor who had nothing would wear the colorless white clothes. Out of all the weapons in the world, there was a longsword that was similar in appearance and abilities to a kitchen knife. However, the longsword required fewer materials, and the blade was at least somewhat lethal. It was easy to learn how to use it. At the very least, it wouldn't hurt one's own people. Naturally, it became the best choice for cannon fodder. As the silly cat described and I imagined it myself, the image of a white-clothed swordsman in my mind was mysteriously replaced by a swarthy farmer warrior. His swarthy face was filled with traces of working in the fields. Although he had a strong body, he had a silly smile on his face, filled with the joy of a good harvest. However, his undyed robe already had several dozen patches on it, yet he was unwilling to throw them away. His straw sandals, which had been washed so many times that they had turned white, were covered in mud. The kitchen knife that was tied to his waist was stabbed into a large radish so that he wouldn't accidentally injure himself. Yes, that's the right image. It's so lifelike. Youngsters truly have a rich imagination. Harlois, it's you. Watch my big cat ball. I used the cat ball technique that I hadn't used for a long time. I grabbed the silly cat by the neck and threw her with great force. I'll be back, meow. Even as I shouted in my mind, I had already transformed into a shooting star. Phew, I feel much better now that I've moved around. After messing around with Harlois, my increasingly depressed mood actually improved slightly. Perhaps this was the silly cat's way of showing concern for others. It was needless to say that undead mages weren't well-liked. In most legends, undead mages would always be considered villains. However, I had just saved someone, yet Harlois was still staring at me as if I were a murderer. This was indeed quite displeasing. You care about what strangers think? It's probably because that little girl is looking at you like this that you're displeased. Perhaps it was because she had once seen a pile of corpses after a massacre. The sight of those bandits' corpses piled up together seemed to make Catalina quite uncomfortable. She looked at me with an even stranger expression as she completely hid behind Barton's back. Do you think that I'm unable to toss you out? Go ahead and toss me. You shameless goddess. Do you really think that I can't handle you? Be careful that I don't read adult magazines overnight. You're too weak. Is this the revenge of a virgin? You should at least go see the real deal. You're a perverted brat with no guts. You deserve to be single for 300 years. If you really want to mess around, who can stop you? I'll die together with you. I'm going to go see the Goblin Playboy right now. The gay version. TSK, those little things hugging each other. I recalled the poster that I happened to see and felt a mysterious sense of discomfort that made me want to vomit. I surrender. Those green little things are so disgusting. They're really willing to sell anything for money. I had finally won. However, a mysterious sense of sorrow was still accumulating in my chest, as if I had accidentally lost something important. Was it my moral integrity? Was it the bottom line? Or was it the last bit of dignity of a pure straight man? Master, I've already left a signal. Everything went smoothly. Tonight's transaction will proceed as usual. A deep voice caused me to focus my attention on the one-eyed large man in front of me. His physical appearance hadn't changed much compared to when he was still alive. Only his skin had darkened, and there was an indescribable aura around him. It was as if something invisible was twisting beneath his skin. The pupil in his remaining eye had disappeared, leaving behind a frightening black cross scar in the middle of the white of his eye. How's your transformation into a Dark Ranger? My arm strength has nearly doubled, and my stamina is limitless. My eyesight has improved by more than 4 or 5 times, and I still need some time to get used to divine arts of darkness. That's all. Killing 3 of my previous selves would be no problem at all. Shink seemed to be quite satisfied with his current strength. He didn't seem to be dissatisfied with his current physical appearance, which would make even a child cry. I nodded in agreement. Don't go overboard. You've lost your sense of pain and fatigue, but that doesn't mean that your muscles won't be damaged or fatigued. This half-dead's physical body structure is still complete. I don't want experimental subject number 2 to mysteriously die before I can obtain enough experimental data. Experimental subject number 2? Of course, as a top-level necromancer, with a soul filled with hatred and a physical body of a legend before me, if I were to simply convert it into an undead, how would I be able to display my skills? Compared to a pure undead, although a half-living half-undead has many of the flaws of the living, it retains the most enviable possibility of growth for undead. Using a legend as the benchmark to create a second half-dead, I really look forward to seeing how far it can go. A second one? The silly cat that I had just tossed out was the first one. However, in order to ensure a high success rate, I didn't care about the cost of creating this prototype. I even used resources like divine sins. Not to mention, the Golden Princess, who was a natural undead, was vastly different from a normal human's soul. The only similarity between Shink and Harlois was probably their conversion ritual. Could this be the case of the first-generation robots generally having cheats, while the second-generation robots were generally extremely unlucky, inexplicably receiving bento? The mass-produced robots looked very powerful, but often after a high-profile appearance, they would suddenly become the source of cannon fodder and miscellaneous soldiers receiving the bento of the masses? So this world was actually a world of players with money? The only difference in combat strength was the difference in resources invested. It would seem that I had unknowingly learned the truth again. Getting back to the main topic, Shink, who was filled with hatred, was indeed a very useful tool for me. In fact, in order to take his emotions into consideration, I even buried the bandits from the Swift Sword mercenary group. Isn't it because you don't like the incomplete ones anymore now that you have this new toy? Silly cat, do you want to fly away again right after returning? Although I was saying that I didn't believe it, I was actually silently agreeing with Harlois' guess. Indeed, compared to Shink, the zombies and skeletons were nothing. Just like Harlois, who had so many restrictions, the Dark Ranger Shink was a pure killing machine. His increased strength was due to the removal of the human body's natural limitations on the physical body. His pure physical strength would be at least 3 times greater than before, and he wouldn't feel any pain at all. Although his heart was still beating, it was no longer his vitals. The core in his brain was his vitals. Inside his brain was the soulfire of an undead lord, which gave him the ability to use dark magic and divine arts. And the buff energy would be able to replenish and heal his constantly injured body, giving him endless life force and stamina. The result of combining life and death would be this physical body of slaughter with limitless potential. Of course, combining life and death would also create a series of side effects and conflict. Perhaps Shink would collapse at that time. But before that happened, he would be able to give me enough power to avenge myself, as well as give me even more useful data and information. If I gave him 2 years, he should be able to use combat strength that far surpassed ordinary saints. But, when considering the possible battles and conflicts, as well as the fact that I might have to face enemies at the same level, I needed even more information. I glanced over at the corpses and helplessly gave up. Just as the silly cat had said, these mortal corpses that weren't even at the silver rank were nothing more than broken bodies. They also didn't have any special bloodlines or abilities. Spending energy on them would be a waste of time. If I made them into something like Stitch demons, that would be far too eye-catching. Not only would I be at the gold rank, many living creatures would also view me with hostility. In the end, I looked over at my companions who were currently chatting with me, the mercenaries and the Northlands trio. It would seem that I'll have to think of a solution from the living. While Roland was still worrying about his lack of trump cards, it was a busy scene in Con Knight's territory. Numerous checkpoints had been set up at the entrance to the mountains. Fully armed royal soldiers were acting as guards, and anyone who approached would be driven away. The mountain residents who relied on the mountains for their livelihood could only think of other method. Facing an unknown threat, the second son of the Archduke, Link, who had just completed his coming-of-age ceremony and received the title of Earl, didn't act rashly and immediately set out. As a mage, he understood just how troublesome the Heletum generation was and what kind of possibilities it held. He knew that it was highly likely that information had been leaked. He only had one chance, so he absolutely had to grasp it. And in half a month's time, when the second batch of reinforcements, including the engineering experts and the Royal Sword Saint, arrived, it would be time for him to set out. In his plan, no matter which country received the information and acted immediately, they would be at least half a month slower than him. But what he didn't know was that his father's mortal enemy, Marquis Tarek, had sent out treasure hunters with the same goal as him. They were already eyeing the area and could forcefully break through the blockade at any moment. Of course, he also didn't know that the seemingly obedient and loyal Night Lord was actually secretly plotting how to let the prince die in an unexpected disaster. And what was even more unfortunate was that a jinx had already arrived. He also had his eyes on the ruins of the Halettim generation, and he himself was already in this not-so-large territory. Chapter 499. With Shink acting as a spy, the Death Council's members had no idea that this traitor had already become an enemy who wanted to take their lives. They were completely unprepared, so it was quite easy for them to pull in the net that very night. Although the person waiting for them at the usual place was the same person they had traded with, the person they were loyal to was quite different. Just one contact was enough for them to be captured by a Dark Ranger. Alright then, I also felt that this one-eyed Dark Ranger was quite awkward. After all, in my previous world, a certain Dark Ranger queen was the most popular. But since that world had developed to the point where even humans could become hunters and rangers, it was quite normal for her to enter the realm of darkness and death and become a Dark Ranger. Although the muscular Dark Ranger was indeed quite blind, unfortunately, I didn't have any Spring of the Drowned Woman left, right, system? Is that Spring of the Drowned Woman thing you mentioned before real? Is it really possible to completely change a person's gender? It's real. Compared to reversing karma, changing a person's gender is quite easy. Actually, you don't even need me to do it. You can do it with your own undead surgery. All you need to do is change a few organs and adjust your hormones. You'll be able to do it in less than an hour. Indeed, unlike modern organ transplants, where I had to worry about organ rejection, infection, and poor nerve contact, undead surgery could be used to easily cut and piece together organs. Any adverse reactions could be resolved with magic, and the technology was quite advanced as well. I paused in surprise upon hearing this. Actually, with my surgical skills, I could even change heads and organs as I pleased. Gender reassignment surgery would be quite simple. But after thinking about it for a moment, I decided to give up on creating a traditional Dark Ranger queen. You've thought of it as well? Yes, changing one's gender isn't a problem, but not becoming blind after changing one's gender is a problem. Do you think that reality is like those useless Japanese anime that casually transforms a tall and muscular man into a beautiful woman? That's far too illogical. Logically speaking, since a man was originally a muscular man, it would be normal for him to directly transform into a muscular auntie. Also, just think about the terrible hygiene conditions in medieval England during my military career. Even if a certain queen was a woman, she would still feel like a violent auntie with a mouth full of vulgarities and vulgarities. Cute girls and whatnot are just otaku's fantasies. Right? Didn't someone make a proof that a certain queen was actually an ugly bald man? I feel like I should apologize immediately, otherwise I'll be killed. By the way, if that's the case, Hua Mulan has been in the army for so many years without being discovered. Is it because she looks like a man? I think I should stop here. Cough, cough, I accidentally went astray. Actually, gender reassignment surgery wasn't difficult at all, and plastic surgery wasn't a big deal either. But when I thought about how the soul of a rough and strong man was hidden inside a slender beauty, and how that crisp yellow voice came from a man who was digging his feet, I didn't feel cute at all. Instead, I felt disgusted. Kolos? Ha, Kolos' gender is Kolos. What's a man? If you were to ask this question to those bastards in Sulphur Mountain City, be careful that they don't beat you up. It is said that the number of members in Kolos's wooing club has already reached 5-digit. Those who haven't joined the club but have ulterior motives have probably reached 6-digit. Even if she doesn't become an idol, it has already become a new cult. That's right, that fellow doesn't seem to be too far away from here. Perhaps I can transfer him over for some eye candy to help out. Alright then, I accidentally went astray. As I looked at that dark-skinned man who was currently looking at me from the top of a tree, I decided to give up on changing his appearance. He also didn't realize that he had just escaped a major disaster. Getting back to the main topic, now that the heavy responsibility on my shoulders had been relieved, I also had much more freedom. And right now, evil undead mages also had their benefits. At the very least, they didn't have to worry about what methods they would use. And so, that unfortunate Death Council priest told me everything from how old he was when he wet his bed. It's even more troublesome than I thought. The Death Council already knew about the ruins when the information was first leaked. However, they didn't pay much attention to it at first. They only sent out a small exploration team consisting of 3 to 5 high-level job class members to explore the ruins for the sake of operating expenses. The end result was that only one acolyte who was active on the outskirts of the ruins survived. This exploration team, which included a gold rank master, was completely annihilated before they could even send out any information about the enemy. Originally, the exploration team should have ended here, but an unexpected piece of news shocked the Death Council in the Solidukedom. There's a place in the ruins with incredibly weak dimensional barriers. It's an excellent place to open a dimensional door. An ordinary gold-rank undead mage actually managed to summon a bone dragon in this place. And so, a new exploration team went on their way. Although this exploration team was tricked 3 times in a row, this time, not only did they bring enough sacrifices, they even brought a holy artifact that the undead emperor had bestowed upon them. The members were all elites, and they themselves were more than half of the Death Council's power. There wasn't just a single saint rank member. If this was bad news, then what came next was a new piece of news that was difficult to differentiate between good and bad. For some unknown reason, the road leading into the mountains had suddenly been blocked by the government, and it was even guarded by the royal guards. The only way to enter the mountains was to forcefully break through, which was why this exploration team, which had the strongest combat strength, was now blocked. Not only that, since the treasure map was sold by unscrupulous merchants and information peddlers, countless Solidukedom adventurer teams and adventurers swarmed into the mountains. The originally sparsely populated small town had now become a large market filled with people. Any newcomer would become a competitor in everyone's eyes. When I heard this news, I felt like I had been tricked. Originally, it was supposed to be a simple treasure hunt, but why did it turn into a major treasure hunt? Perhaps I would even have to fight against the government. At this rate, there would definitely be even more ridiculous things waiting for me in the future. Wait a moment, in that case, the Death Council's priests will also be at that small town's checkpoint? They'll definitely try to break through. Perhaps I can use them to pass through. As I looked at the obedient Death Council worshippers before me, I gradually came up with a method that I was already quite used to. Perhaps, as long as I used it properly, the Death Council's incredibly strong combat strength would actually be a good thing. The pure power of death transformed into a roaring skull in my palm. The mark of death was the best evidence of my power. Little brat, you should have died. Becoming my experimental subject was your only possibility, but now that the situation has changed slightly, I have a suggestion. Perhaps you'll volunteer to help me. Of course, you don't have to be willing. I'm still lacking experimental materials. Although he was a Death Council worshipper, this middle-aged priest nodding furiously seemed to fear death as well. After making some arrangements and having the others deal with the villagers, I finished up with the trivial matters at hand and directly returned to the camp's tent to rest. Even though it was already night, the sounds of people in the camp didn't stop. The villagers who had just escaped were still in a state of excitement from escaping a sea of suffering during the day. But when night fell, they calmed down and thought about their family members who were no longer here, as well as their ruined homes. I didn't know where the first sound came from, but when this suppressed sorrow spread, the entire camp was filled with the sound of crying. An old man hugged a child and sobbed quietly. A woman thought about her man and cried loudly as she worried about the future. A young man thought about how he would never see his family again, and his tears couldn't help but fall down. In this cruel world, such things were far too common. The experienced adventurers had long since expected this. They would either hide in their tents and plug their ears, or go to sleep before anyone else did. For the young adventurers, this would be quite difficult for them to get used to in such a short period of time. Katerina silently sobbed as she leaned against her adoptive father, as if recalling her own bitter experience. The Northlands trio had different reactions. Mary had an unpleasant expression, but the dark elf was already used to parting. She took off her heavy armor and climbed onto a pine tree branch in the campsite. She took out a 5-stringed wooden harp and lightly sang a soul-sending song in the elven language. A melodious and calm foreign tune echoed in the campsite. This tune had a hint of farewell, but it wasn't sad. However, the crying became louder. The youngest Nephilic judge, Thor, had an expression of confusion. This was a real adventure. Compared to the epic adventure that he had been looking forward to in the past, this seemed to be quite different. According to the legends, shouldn't the villagers who were rescued offer flowers and kisses? Why were they so sad even though they had just obtained freedom? The elves' soul-sending song was still echoing in his ears. The scene before him was constantly challenging his understanding. The mortal's sadness told him that the great adventure that he had dreamed of wasn't as simple as it seemed in the books. The villagers, who seemed like the background of a legendary story, also had their own lives, sadness, and happiness. Perhaps their little bit of happiness wasn't even worth mentioning in front of the nobles, but that was all they had. They didn't have anyone to return home to. Even the villagers themselves had almost become slaves. There was nothing wrong with crying and venting a little, right? There was no need for flowery rhetoric. The pain of losing one's family and home would be felt by the good. The gnome's usually comical expression became serious in front of such sincere sorrow. He hesitated, as if he wanted to do something to tell the villagers that there was still hope in the future. Let them cry. What can you do? Say some insignificant words of comfort? Don't disturb them. However, he was pulled back by his companions. Mary, who also had an ashen expression, was also quite displeased. This wasn't the first time she had encountered something like this. She knew that any consolation from an outsider would only make things worse. However, Saul suddenly shook off his companion's hands and ran over to them with his short legs. I am not here to comfort you. I have a type of power here that doesn't require any natural talent. Even an ordinary person can learn it. It can protect you and prevent something like this from happening again. The gnome was nervous to begin with. He was already stuttering, which made his speech even more incoherent. However, as he poured his emotions into this power, he became more and more courageous, and his not-so-loud voice became even louder and clearer. Yes, the power of law will definitely protect you. This is the purpose of that Lord's creation. He didn't create this power to provide the strong with a new tool to bully the weak. Law and the power of law are both for the sake of protecting and rescuing the weak. This is a power that anyone can try to grasp. He created this power for the sake of protecting and punishing sinners. Saul took off the chain around his neck and placed the symbol of the scale in his hand. The next instant, a silver glow ignited on it. As holy fire swirled around it, the pitch-black clouds were parted, and a ray of silver light shone down on the gnome's body. It seemed as if an invisible eye was watching this place from the sky. A miracle that has a minuscule chance of happening? No, the pillar of law of the Hades will never rest. Anyone can seek justice and rescue from it. We don't blindly worship the gods, but we respect the gods of the Hades, because they give salvation and protection to the weak, and punish the unjust. Saul opened the bag on his back and handed over the law books and study notes to the villagers who were at a loss. First learn law theory, then start learning the difference between law and holy light. Midway through his sentence, Saul recalled the scene he saw in Sulphur Mountain City. Now he understood why the most basic books in the bookstore were always so popular. Many of the customers were old judges with decades of experience in law. Logically speaking, they wouldn't need these beginner books anymore. Now he understood why the judges and Justice Knight of Justice, who just went out on official business, would always go buy more books as soon as they could. Did you lose any of your books? No, I gave them to someone else. Spreading the law? That's great. You have new believers of law? Why don't you bring more? Bring more? No matter how much I bring, it won't be enough. Why am I telling you all this? You'll understand in the future. The memories of the past flashed through Saul's mind, and he smiled bitterly. This time, he really understood. However, looking at the scene in front of him, he would rather not have understood. Perhaps, when the entire world was so cruel, no matter how much he brought, it would be meaningless. Is it really possible? Even people like us can obtain power? Suddenly, a hurried question came from the confused crowd. It was a young and skinny boy who was barely wearing any clothes. He had just been hugging his grandfather and crying, but now his eyes were filled with hope. It was Saul's miracle and words that gave him hope for the future. Smack. Saul viciously slapped himself in the face. His face instantly turned red and swollen, but Saul didn't feel anything at all. He felt ashamed of his own moment of confusion. It's meaningless to me? Foolish Saul, it's enough as long as it's meaningful to them. The judges who just walked out of the school took a deep breath as they did their best to recall how their teacher had taught them. Saul then began explaining his own path of law to ordinary people, just like how he had thousands of seniors before him. First of all, you must understand what the power of law and law is. This isn't some powerful offensive power. Behind Saul, the dark elf on the tree nodded slightly. Only now did she begin to acknowledge this companion of hers. The sound of the soul-sending song silently stopped, allowing the gnome's ear-piercing lecture to travel even further into the night. At the same time, in the largest and most luxurious tent in the campsite, the person who should have already fallen asleep reached out and pulled down the curtains, retracting his gaze. He picked up a handwritten book by his side and began to write down what he had learned today. This book was nearing the end and was about to be completed. The cover of this handwritten book was titled Unconventional Uses of the Power of Hades on Law Incantations, allowing low-level law mages to have a chance at survival against high-level law mages. Chapter 500. The next day, the sky had just begun to brighten, and the temporary campsite was already filled with the clamor of people. Those who had been traveling for a long time knew that there was a limit to the amount of time they could travel in a day. Setting out early in the morning seemed to have become a common rule in most situations. But when most of the people started to pack and prepare, someone ran over to say goodbye to me. Stay behind to help rebuild the village? Sure. My reply was very straightforward, so straightforward that Saul's face was full of surprise. In fact, there was nothing to guess. Saul definitely didn't stay behind just to rebuild a village. Since he had already decided to spread the seeds of law, it was easy for the seeds to wither. It was natural to take care of them while they were still weak. Moreover, with the protection of a silver profession, the villagers would have the courage to return to their homes. After all, bandits weren't the only threats in this world. Wild beasts and magical beasts were equally deadly. During the attack of the Swift Sword Group, the militia that could only deal with the wild wolves were instantly killed. After that, because the bandits were few in number, all the strong men who could pose a threat were killed. The only ones left were the elderly who could be sold as sacrifices, as well as the more valuable children and women. If there were only these villagers, rebuilding the village itself would be a difficult problem, not to mention the dangers that they might encounter. On the other hand, if there wasn't enough security, they could only become wanderers and go to a bigger town to make a living. If they had some skills, they could still support themselves, but if they didn't do well, they could become beggars or prostitute. If they rebuilt their homes, the fields would still be there. Maybe this year's crops would be harvested. With the compensation from the Swift Sword Group, at least they wouldn't have to worry about food and clothing. If they could live well at home, who would want to leave their homes? What about your two companions? Are they going with you? No, I've discussed it with them. They decided to go to the ruins to take a look. They should be needed there. I nodded. This was also what I expected. Then, I handed him a piece of paper. Bring a few people with you. Rebuilding requires strength. Mercenaries are good at it. After they finish the rebuilding work, hire them to protect the town for a while. One person won't be able to do it. Barton's bet is 17 gold coins? Is this a gambling debt? Yes, this paper was a record of some gambling debt. I painfully searched for it for a long time before throwing him a small bag of gold coins. That's right. Even if it's a bet, it's also a commission. This is what I promised them. I've hand-picked these fellows, and they're all experienced and trustworthy veterans. Don't worry about using them. Just as the little goblin was about to leave with a face full of gratitude, I continued. What a pity. Miracle Hand Timlad is probably the most knowledgeable engineer in the entire world. I've heard that he's already created a new path for goblin engineering. To a goblin engineer, being able to meet a great engineer was undoubtedly a precious opportunity. It was just like how a student from an art school could meet a great artist. Not only was it a meet and greet with an idol, but it was also a chance for one to improve greatly through communication. Timlad was no ordinary great engineer. He was a genius engineer who played a critical role in the magical engineering revolution. Countless goblins and dwarves viewed him as the wisest person in the eyes of the gnomes and dwarves. If Timlad missed out on this chance to talk to Timlad, all right, seeing how the previously grateful expression on the goblin's face instantly turned awkward, and feeling that the anger in the goblin's heart had turned into depression and helplessness, I smiled proudly. Humph, since you're asking me to pay, how could I possibly let you leave so easily? You're so awkward. You're already paying, so can't you just happily be a good person? Tisk, I'm a good person to begin with. Yep, a good person who's more than 300 years old. Perhaps you'll be a good person for the rest of your life. What a vicious curse. I wish you a good cat for the rest of your life. The silly cat shook her head, seemingly uninterested in an elementary schooler's argument. Still, this brat is quite lucky. With your recommendation letter to Shueti, he'll definitely be able to rise through the ranks in the future. Ha, you don't understand those bastards from the 4 halls of justice. In their eyes, a good seedling that they value is equivalent to a newbie that needs to be repeatedly tempered. Someone that I personally recommend is equivalent to a 100% hardworking. You want to rise through the ranks? You'll have to torture yourself to death first. Although Thor's previous performance made me feel rather helpless, at least I was quite satisfied with his performance last night. That was why I intended to send a recommendation letter to Shueti, the current highest-ranked bishop of the Church of Law. He's no longer called the highest-ranked bishop. Last month, I received news that he's been changed to the highest-ranked judge. All the priests and priests of the law faction are now called by the judicial job class. However, Harlois's words attracted my attention. Restoring the Sulphur Mountain City era's first-ranked judge, second-ranked judge, and so on? Isn't this clearly breaking away from the old True Gods church system? How will the other True Gods churches react to such a drastic change in religion? It seemed that this was only a change in the way they addressed each other, but if one carefully thought about it, it meant that the law job class was going to replace the Church of Law's divine duties in the judicial system. This was the beginning of a religious reform that would remove the authority of the Hades. This also meant that the law faction truly believed in the law itself and not the god of law. This seemed like a small matter, but the significance was immense. It was basically the equivalent of declaring war against the traditional True God's churches. It could be foreseen that the resistance would be even greater. No reaction. Not a single member of the Church of Law above the rank of bishop has expressed an opinion. Even though this was supposed to be a joyous success, Harlow's emotions were filled with worry, as if this was the worst possible news. No reaction? How is that possible? Oh, they intend to settle the score later. If Harlow's expressed an opinion that was neither light nor heavy, it would be the equivalent of tacitly agreeing to the Church of Law's religious reform. Such a reform had already touched upon the foundations of the True God's churches. Belief in concepts and belief in the God of personality were natural enemies to begin with. Unless the God of personality intended to merge with the concept, they would settle the score sooner or later. Of course, it was also possible to treat this as a special case and ignore it. However, this was the equivalent of having a materialist among a group of religious believers, which would greatly increase their hatred and dissatisfaction. The God of Law and his churches don't even accept offerings or money, so why are you guys able to accept them? Also, they say that criminals will enter hell, but you guys say that as long as you offer enough money you can enter heaven. Just who's right? They're also God's priests who possess divine arts and divine power, but they're able to survive on their own. Why are you guys able to live without worries just by praying? Why? Perhaps by that time, even the Pope of the Holy Church wouldn't be able to answer these questions. In that case, the best way for the divine job class members of the True God's churches to deal with this would probably be to temporarily pretend that they didn't see these heretics, and then settle the score later. Shueti is still too impatient. It's still too early, and he'll attract the hostility of the other neutral True Gods. Harlow stopped midway through his complaint. He chose that Minotaur, who had so many bad habits, to be the leader of the Church of Law because he had a steady personality and wasn't an impatient person. And even if he really couldn't stop himself, there was still Lilith, Cain, and the others to stop him. How long has it been since you last read religious magazines? Alright, I know that you hate those things the most, so let me tell you. Those scammers followed the trend to scam money, and half of the magazines were filled with all sorts of religious slogans and preaching. Some bastards even added weak hypnosis runes to guide the readers to believe in their religion. Don't even think about making me pay a single copper for such a spiritual pollutant. Yep, it's just that it's not worth it. It's definitely not that I'm stingy. The last part of the story is completely lacking in momentum, and it also reveals the truth. Harlois really liked to subscribe to all sorts of preaching magazines, especially those from the elven gods. Fine then, it seemed that this silly cat wasn't any different from before. She even called me stingy and vengeful. Since 2 years ago, there have been many churches of True Gods complaining that the law job class has taken over and invaded their parishes. Because of this, there have been at least 200 disputes. Last year, the number of complaints was more than 3 times that number. This year, how many are there this year? I could more or less understand what was going on after hearing this. We haven't even started yet this year, and there have already been more than 8,000 complaints. More than 90 churches have complained to more than 240 countries. Do you need me to summarize all of them for you? F***ck, doesn't nearly half the world object to the Church of Law? The entire world's public enemy? Now, I finally understood why the Church of Law's priests and Holy Knight would travel thousands of kilometers from the Sala Dukedom's capital the moment the Church of Law members arrived in Anton Town. This was basically the Church of Law's reputation for poaching members. If it wasn't for the fact that the Holy War was still ongoing, it would have been quite a joke already. You're doing such a wonderful job. His gloomy mood was completely swept away. The other countries and churches' protests? Let them protest all they want. After all, there wouldn't be a civil war before the Holy War ended, and it wouldn't hurt if they were cursed at. Originally, I was worried that spreading the Church of Law would attract too much hostility. But now that there was hostility on such a large scale, it meant that the Church of Law had already spread far and wide enough. The Church of Law was already used to being treated with hostility. Many places are already calling the spreading of the Church of Law the Law Plague. I couldn't help but laugh at this. Indeed, from a certain standpoint, the spreading of the Church of Law did indeed feel like a natural plague. Let's take the villagers of Lanty village as an example. If Thor had successfully planted the seeds of law here, it was likely that several dozen low-level law job class members would have appeared in less than 2 years. And if one of the law job class members went to another village, perhaps several hundred law job class members would be born. And if the Church of Law continued to spread, it really did feel like a plague, like a cult. The original plan was that it would take at least 30 years to spread the Church of Law to the entire world, but it was accomplished in just 7 years? This is even more like a cult than a cult. In the end, the reason why the Church of Law job class was able to spread so quickly was because of its own special characteristic. In a world where the strong preyed on the weak, anything that could give ordinary people power would naturally spread incredibly quickly. This was also the foundational reason why evil god churches were unable to do anything despite being banned. Believing in a true god was correct, but a true god wouldn't just casually give something in return. Meanwhile, evil gods would always be able to fulfill every request and improve in power much faster. In this world, actual power was far more convincing than any empty teachings. From a certain standpoint, the Church of Law was even worse than a cult. After all, a cult that worshipped devils, demons, and other such things would give you power and fulfill your wishes, but they would definitely cheat you of something more valuable. Meanwhile, the Church of Law could also give you power, but it wouldn't require any price. The Church of Law didn't need to establish a church, nor did it need to pray to a true God. It didn't need expensive religious rituals. The Church of Law only needed to believe in the fairness and protection of the Church of Law. Let's not talk about all those grand empty words. This greatly reduced the cost of cultivation, as well as the difficulty of spreading the Church of Law. A small booklet would be far more difficult to guard against than any evil ritual. The Church of Law specialized in protection and punishment. It didn't have any offensive capabilities. The local domain lords would be delighted to see the birth of law job class members who specialized in protection in their territory. Perhaps law job class members couldn't be used to invade others, but they could protect their towns and chase away wild beasts and invaders. Not only that, these powerful law job class members who followed the path of law wouldn't threaten the domain lords, temporarily, ruling status. On a deeper level, law job class members could even attack the local traditional divine authority and expand the domain lord's authority. From a certain standpoint, this was a competition between royal authority and divine authority. If it wasn't for the domain lords adding fuel to the fire and introducing each other, the Church of Law probably wouldn't have spread so quickly. The most important part was that the Church of Law had an incredibly low barrier to entry, and it grew rapidly. This caused mortals who desired to control their own fates to take the initiative to learn it. Of course, there would naturally be quite a few who pretended to believe in law for the sake of power. However, it would be impossible to master law incantations if one didn't have a devout and understanding of law. And even if one mastered law incantations, they would become arrogant after obtaining power and do something for their own selfish desires. God's law, the 7th sin of the 13 sins. Anyone who takes bribes, breaks the law, or neglects their duties shall be stripped of all their positions and demoted to a commoner. The lies of the past had become concrete reality. Womian's saying that he would always watch over you wasn't just empty words. Once you lost the power of law, you would never be able to obtain it again. And all of this was because of Womian's, who had already reached main god rank, and the Hades faction's main headquarters, the Hades Purgatory. Only with sufficient divine power would one be able to summon divine miracles as easily as possible. Last night's divine miracle caused several dozen people to choose the path of law, giving them the seeds of law. And more faith gave them more divine power. I previously mentioned that for true gods, the holy war was both a test and an opportunity. And the God of Law seemed to have already grasped this opportunity. Perhaps, back in the day, holy light had also grown in such a manner. In the end, it completely went out of control. And the current God of Law was already tightly bound by the laws, destined to become a cog in the Hades. Since things have already reached this point, I might as well add some more fuel to the fire. And so, I opened up my own letter and started to think of a letter to Shueti and Lilith. Chapter 501. The sky was now completely bright. After Thor and a few disgruntled mercenaries led the villagers on their way, the campsite was more or less cleaned up. It was also time for everyone else to set out. However, unlike what I had expected, the first to set out were the mercenaries. They were led by Mary and Winston, who were also mercenaries. Mary and Winston made up the majority of the group. According to my new plan, they would openly enter Starwood City, the capital of the new knight's territory. The fully armed mercenaries would naturally attract the attention of the adventurers, and they would act as a cover for another group of people in the dark. Old Barton was also among them. My mission for him was to not be afraid of trouble and to cause trouble. Yep, that's right, I wanted him to cause trouble for me. Even if it was a trial where he could make a name for himself, it was still to cause trouble. Even if I don't go, I can guess at the current situation in Starwood City. Nobody likes people who stand in their way, especially those who stand in the way of making money. The Sala Dukedom's officials will definitely provoke both sides to hate each other. You can use your identity as an adventurer to provoke the officials and make a big deal out of it. Many people are just waiting for a fuse. With the Dragon Lich supporting me, I really wasn't afraid of making a big deal out of it. I was only afraid that it wouldn't be big enough. If the mercenaries were in the light, then the other group would be in the dark. The other group, or perhaps I should say 3 people and a ghost, was me, the anti-holy knight Tiana, and Catalina. Yep, there was also that Death Council disciple named Brad. As for that ghost, it was naturally the Dark Ranger Shink, who had already become my undead servant. There was a ranger, an undead mage, and a melee knight. There was a damage dealer, a tank, and a maid in charge of cleaning and taking care of daily necessities. Although we didn't have a priest who could heal us, and although we didn't have 8 job classes, this team was still quite balanced. Listen up. From now on, I'm the disciple of the great Lich slain, the legendary undead mage Karo. You, the maid Lena, and you, my personal guard Tiana. I listened to my mentor's instructions, and also because of my own ambitions, I joined the Death Council. The great Lich slain really did exist. He was one of the counselors of the Shilua Empire's Dark Knight Council, which had colluded with the undead emperors from the Death Plains. However, not many people knew that he had completely perished in the Undead Plains civil war. It would be quite easy for someone to use one of Slane's relics and impersonate Slane's successor. Since Slane had connections with the undead emperors to begin with, it would be completely logical for him to have his disciple join the Death Council. Necromancers didn't need to find any reason to join the Death Council. The Dark Rangers under their command were undead themselves. As long as Tiana put away her identity as an anti-knight and disguised herself as an ordinary dark elf martial artist, they would be a standard evil team. They would naturally be able to gain the friendship of the Death Council and the enmity and vigilance of normal government organizations. As for bringing a maid with them, actually, there were quite a few mages with strange habits who were difficult to serve. Although this would attract some unnecessary attention, compared to the trouble this key might cause if it left my sight, it would definitely be better for me to slightly tarnish my reputation. As for the tragic scene when the father and daughter left, the joke about how Boss Huang angrily tried to steal a farmer's daughter, and the pitiful expression in her eyes as she cowered in the corner of the carriage, let's just forget about it. After those mercenaries disappeared from my sight, I began to get busy. Let's paint it black first. Pure color wouldn't mean anything, but if an undead mage really did ride this thing and appear on the streets of Starwood Town with those strange gargoyles, I would probably instantly become famous, and the rapid spread of interesting news would make any disguise meaningless. Of course, if I only painted it black, my skill level would be too low. And so, I performed a small ritual. After I pretended to say an incantation, a certain river and part of the river connected to this place successfully, and a small hole in front of me was filled with some reddish-black blood. Then, I took out some white gemstones, jades, and tossed them into the blood pool. Demon transformation. The gay gargoyle was directly tossed into the blood pool, and the white gemstone sank into his forehead. The next instant, a large amount of blood was absorbed by the gemstone, and then the gargoyle's entire body began to distort. Thick black hair grew out of his face and limbs, and his gemstone eyes glowed with a pitch-black light. His white elf-like skin shattered, and his original magic runes and stone parts actually merged with the black blood in the blood pool, becoming new muscle tissue. Soon, the gargoyle's final human form was gone. He was now 2 feet taller than he originally was, and his muscles were abnormally muscular with strange magic runes. The horn on his forehead and his gemstone eyes gave off a ferocious light, and his original feathered wings had been reconstructed into demonic black wings. His entire person had transformed into an evil demon from hell. In the eyes of others, it was as if a handsome elf had been tossed into the blood pool, but what came out was an ugly demon. It could only be said that this was an extremely evil and terrifying magic spell that could transform an undead creature into such a state. Catalina had already finished hiding behind Diana's back. It wasn't any high-level incantation or magical ritual, but I was probably the only one in this world who could do such a thing. After all, these materials and rituals weren't from the mortal world. After the experiment was successful, I sent other gargoyles in. This time, the female gargoyles didn't turn into ugly demons. Although their faces and skin were covered in magic runes, and their skin had become much darker, they still retained their beauty. In contrast, the cute little curved horn on their foreheads and their red lips, which had become even more alluring, made them seem more real and alluring. This wasn't something I intentionally did. It was just a natural characteristic of the ghost race. The males were strong and mighty, while the females were beautiful and moving. However, seeing how everyone else was looking at me, it was likely that I couldn't take off my gentleman hat anymore. After all, these naked gargoyles that belonged to me were already my precedents. I helplessly shook my head and ignored the silly cats snickering through our soul connection. It would seem that some things would be difficult to escape from. Now it was time for proper business. One undead creature after another was tossed into the blood pool, and their appearances underwent fundamental changes. In the end, the ghost carriage and the unicorn also completed their transformations. Our group had now completely transformed into the evil faction. Even if the mercenaries were still here, they probably wouldn't be able to recognize us. Let's go. We'll talk on the way. Starwood City. Calling it a city would be too much of an exaggeration. As the capital of a Knight territory, it was indeed the largest city in the territory. However, the title of Knight was the lowest of all domain lords. So, the title of largest was actually quite pitiful. Starwood City had a population of 60,000 people squeezed into a small city. There were only about 100 city guards, and the city walls were only slightly more than 3 meters tall. The domain lord's residence was nothing more than a tattered bunker without any heavy defense machinery. The only local specialties were the local crops and stone-like black bread. It couldn't be any worse. After the news about the treasure map spread, this super-remote city suddenly received many visitors. Not only were all the inns full, even the residences were full. In fact, many tents and temporary camps had even appeared outside the city. Not to mention, there were also the Sala Royal Army stationed outside the city. In just a short period of time, the city's population had nearly doubled. The atmosphere in the city was quite tense. Passers-by hurriedly came and went. It could be said that a storm was brewing. Meanwhile, in a temporary camp outside the city, my team was currently resting and organizing. Shink had taken Brad to the city to leave a communication imprint. We could only wait for them to come find us. Finding an evil cult that was skilled at hiding itself wouldn't be that easy. Barton's group had already entered the city. However, it still seemed rather peaceful. However, the camps in the outskirts were rather chaotic. That was because many treasure hunters were desperados. Not to mention, the fact that the path into the mountains had been sealed off made everyone even more frustrated. Murder, robbery, gambling, and other crimes were all good ways for desperados to vent their frustrations. And since I was here, the demons would appear at night. The nighttime here had been slightly quieter for 2 days, and I had more undead materials in my storage. Of course, I was riding in a ghost carriage, bringing so many strange-looking high-level undead into the city in such a high-profile manner. Plus, I had Shink execute a few troublemakers as an example to the others. I had gained quite a bit of notoriety in this area. This would probably make it easier for the Death Council to confirm my identity. During a critical mission, a helper who suddenly appeared would always be suspicious. If the Death Council came looking for me of their own volition, then it would naturally be much less suspicious. While I was waiting for the Death Council to come looking for me, a familiar person actually came looking for me right before the Death Council arrived. Chapter 502. The Boulder Heavy Infantry Squadron was the Sala Dukedom's undefeatable shield. They were also the Ace Heavy Infantry Squadron with the title of Royalty. These heavy infantry soldiers were all huge men who were over 2 meters tall. Many of them had barbarian or beastman bloodlines. They had undergone training and were skilled at using heavy axes, spears, and tower shields. They were especially skilled at forming battle formations to defeat stronger enemies. During the military reforms several years ago, their alchemists had combined these weapons together. This heavy military uniform, known as the Thunder Axe and Shield, was known as a lethal weapon on the battlefield. Yep, this was also a product of magical engineering. When the revolution of the new generation arrived, nobody would be willing to allow themselves to fall behind. Even a certain muddle-headed dynasty had spent a large amount of money to create a modern fleet of ships. Facing the new generation's changes, the Sala Dukedom's royal family gritted their teeth and opened up their national treasury. The Boulder Heavy Infantry Squadron was one of the first to benefit from this. If I had to give an evaluation, this shield of Sala Dukedom would probably be rated as an average level 3 silver-ranked weapon. Although all aspects of the shield of Sala Dukedom had improved greatly after the Dawn era, this was still an excellent evaluation. With such a group of strong men blocking the mountain path and setting up sentries, it was likely that even thieves would be unable to pass through. Forcefully breaking through would be the equivalent of declaring war against the Sala Dukedom. Thieves would only be waiting to be on the wanted list. It was no wonder that the adventurers had such a headache. However, for me, breaking through this so-called blockade wouldn't be difficult at all. There were many of them, and they were quite strong. They could indeed seal off the ground. I could simply fly over. For ordinary small countries, aerial night soldiers were quite expensive and impractical. A single aerial knight would cost enough to support an entire squadron. Not only that, the young and eggs of various flying magical beasts would often be highly sought after on the black market. However, after the Dawn era, aerial knight soldiers became much more approachable. Not to mention those aerial magical beasts with astonishing appetites, magical engineering products could also be used to create aerial aircrafts and battleship. Of course, the price wouldn't be low, but at least there would be channels to obtain them. and once other countries had organized aerial knights, no matter how reluctant they would still have to purchase them. From a certain standpoint, this was also another world's military competition. Of course, some unscrupulous merchants wouldn't let go of such a good opportunity. Due to the participation of some unreliable fellows, a batch of goods that couldn't be evaluated normally flowed into the market. The cheapest flying equipment for individual soldiers. It doesn't require any additional equipment slots. It's as comfortable as undergarments. It's small in size, light in weight, and consumes less energy. What are you waiting for? Hurry up and buy Flying Pigeon 2. Don't be fooled by the advertising slogan. He wasn't lying. It was indeed as comfortable as underwear. He was underwear, steel jet underwear. The principle was similar to a power backpack. It was convenient to carry it on one's body, and it also consumed less energy. It was perfect, no way. The high temperature of the jet would make the lower part of the body as comfortable as a volcano. And even if you had to endure this, the Flying Pigeon No. 4 indeed solved the problem of high temperature. The scene of yore but spewing colorful flames and smoke into the sky couldn't be more beautiful. It was said that even if some people were tricked into buying a batch of the Flying Pigeon No. 4, those first-rate warriors would reject it after trying it out. Of course, the Flying Pigeon No. 5 was the weirdest of the weirdest. There weren't any trial products for promotion at all. But for arms dealers, not only could they recover their research funds, but they could also test the products in actual battles. It wasn't too profitable. Alright, after saying so much, I roughly knew what was going to happen. In the 5th year of the Dawn Era, which was 2 years ago, when Sasa Dukedom learned that its neighboring country had purchased a large number of power backpacks, it dispatched an arms procurement specialist. But it was a pity that the procurement specialist apparently didn't hear the joke of the classic flying underwear. Instead, he purchased them according to the advertising slogan and instruction manual. The lucky ones were that the flying underwear was proven to be an utterly foolish decision at that time. The products were all taken off the shelf. The unlucky ones were the Sasa Dukedom's procurement specialist. He was also tricked by the advertising slogan and gave up on the increasingly mature power backpack system. Instead, he directly bought the replacement for the flying underwear, the flying skateboarding shoes. Alright, it would indeed look cool to fly in a pair of flaming boots. However, the prerequisite was that the boots were controllable. Reality proved that the flying skateboarding shoes were an even more foolish idea than the flying underwear. At the very least, the flying underwear could be touched by the hands and could be controlled. As for the boots, let's not talk about how one would have to lower one's head to touch the shoes while in midair. It would be possible to change the angle of the flying underwear's propellers at will. If one really bent down and changed their center of gravity, they would be able to enjoy a hellish chain of flips in midair. Outsiders might find this comical and funny, but for warriors it was impossible to laugh at, especially when several young people directly fell to the ground. However, this didn't mean that the designer was too foolish. After all, in a certain dimension, there were flying tanks, self-destructing hunting dogs, balloon bombs, airship bombers, and other strange weapons. These weapons were all powerful weapons used to kill one's own people. Most of the time, the design would be correct. However, as long as there was even the slightest flaw in the actual technology or operation, the exquisite design would become utterly foolish. This was especially the case in this world, where aerodynamics, fluid mechanics, and other theories didn't exist. Designing flying equipment itself was a bit like trying your luck. After all, after a series of ridiculous products, the jetpack that I had drawn the blueprint for was still the most practical. After all, this was also a mature product that had been proven over time in another world. Mature arms merchants would usually buy and sell classic weapons that had been tested in actual combat, rather than new weapons that looked cool and cheap. Obviously, buying such a thing would be incredibly foolish. However, the market would always mature by constantly being scammed and scammed by others. In the beginning, when the international arms market was still quite chaotic, it was always necessary to pay the tuition. However, it was said that the person who bought this jetpack was a member of the royal family. How could the royal family allow these weapons to rust in a warehouse after traveling thousands of kilometers? Wouldn't that be proof of the royal family's stupidity? In the end, these weapons were forcefully given to the frontline troop. Not only that, there were actually people who used them. Someone would always be able to think of a solution. It was just that the posture was rather foolish. Since it was impossible to control the switch beneath my feet, wouldn't it be enough for me to use a long pole/thin string to control it from afar? Alright, they indeed flew upwards. After a long period of training, they were able to control their own direction. However, they were flying in the sky while holding two poles/long strings in their hands to adjust their direction. Their four limbs were all tied up. Apart from scouting, they couldn't even think about doing battle. By the way, although flying seemed quite foolish, this method of controlling it actually spread far and wide. Many people, unlucky bastards, who also bought the soaring boots used this method to control the boot. This could be considered making good use of trash. And as far as I knew, apart from the gnome delivery companies, only Sasa could fly in the sky with these boots. Even if I didn't summon a bone dragon, they wouldn't be able to stop me if I had a gargoyle carry me in the sky. Could it be that this is the reason why those Death Council members went looking for dragon corpses? They need a large bone dragon that can fly over a mountain range? All types of flying mounts had their limit. Flying required 10 or even 100 times more energy than walking on the ground. This was determined by the natural laws of gravity in this world. Flying beasts required large amounts of heat, and flying magical machines required additional energy to replenish themselves. Even undead creatures couldn't fly endlessly. Ordinary gargoyles couldn't fly very high. Not only would their bodies be damaged if they flew for too long, they would also need to replenish mana for their soul cores. This limited the furthest they could fly. Ordinary flying magical beasts also needed to replenish their flesh and blood. Only legend-ranked undead like bone dragons could easily break through the mountain range's limit. Bone dragons weren't easy to deal with. Every bone dragon represented the death of a gigantic dragon. Without a dragon corpse, how were they supposed to create bone dragons? It would also be inconvenient to bring bone dragons around in human countries. Many scattered pieces of information seemed to be connected together. My goal was now clear on paper. No matter who entered the mountain range, I could reluctantly accept it. However, the Death Council couldn't. The moment they entered the ruins and successfully opened the dimensional door, it would be the equivalent of starting a new war. While the Sala Dukedom was forcefully preventing adventurers from entering the mountain range, many adventurers secretly contacted each other. And when I arrived here as a legend-ranked undead mage, I also received an invitation to a private meeting to discuss how to break through the blockade. It would seem that many people were already eager to make a move. But just as I was preparing to go to the meeting, I received an unexpected piece of news that gave me a pleasant surprise. Timlad is here? Timlad had been quite arrogant when he arrived. He brought along a small assault airship that streaked across the sky like a meteor and directly landed near our campsite. Soon, he used those messy things to find me in front of him. I felt rather complex emotions as I looked at his familiar yet unfamiliar face. Back when we parted, little Timlad had only been around 9 years old. Now that 7 years had passed, it would be normal for him to be around 16 or 17 years old. The snot-nosed child in my memories had now become a handsome young man, but it's fine if he's taller than me. After all, he's still in puberty. What's the meaning of only wearing underwear and having muscles all over his body? Did you also join the Wild Bull sect? Or has that evil cult already spread to the entire country? My angry roar was filled with fear. The little boy who was obsessed with his older sister in my memories had instantly transformed into a muscular bro. This change reminded me of certain bastards, which made me feel even more uneasy. Could it be that Shueti and Eaglestorm had truly succeeded in spreading their way of life? The entire Northlands and the Mist Alliance's higher-ups had all become such strange creatures? His thick and hoarse voice was clearly in the process of changing his voice. There was even a small mustache under his nose that he purposely kept. He lifted the tool belt that was connected to his white underwear, rubbed his firm muscles, and then smiled in a simple and honest manner. "Big brother Roland, don't think too much into it. I'm still quite normal. It's just that I've been playing with machines for the past few years and moving heavy things every day, so of course I've trained my muscles. As for my clothes, the temperature gets high with so many machines, and it's quite uncomfortable to work in such a hot place all the time. It's better to work like this. I rushed over as soon as I received your letter, and I didn't even have time to change my clothes." I heaved a sigh of relief, but the next instant I became nervous again. Look, since I'm already full of muscles, the correct training methods and scientific fitness equipment have created my perfect muscle ratio. I was the runner-up in last year's bodybuilding competition. Plus, I'm quite skilled in engineering, so I'm quite popular with girls. He puffed out his chest muscles and showed off his bicep. All of these were standard bodybuilding movements. What was with bodybuilding competitions? It would seem that the bastards left behind by Omar were still harming the Mist Alliance's youths. When I get back, I'm going to throw those bastards into a frying pan. I shook my head and tossed all these useless thoughts to the back of my mind. Perhaps Timlad's great transformation was actually a good thing. "Little brat, put on your clothes and get ready to go. It's probably impossible for anyone to connect you to the genius engineer. Come, accompany me to a meeting. Let's meet the adventurers' leaders." Chapter 503. A familiar face, a slightly familiar voice, and a completely unfamiliar body. This was the first impression that Timlad gave me. "The letter was directly sent to you? You didn't tell anyone that I was here, did you?" "Of course, I came here immediately after receiving the letter. Is there really a ruin from the Halettim generation?" "Of course. Otherwise, why would I ask you to come here? That maid who's with me should be a pure artificial soul. Didn't you notice?" "Is that for real?" "Back then, now, that wasn't the direction of my research. I heard that my research on pure artificial souls hasn't been going well." "You've already achieved some results?" "Not going well. It would be strange if little Timlad didn't have any secrets at all since he was able to reach his current level. It would be impossible to hide the mysteries of his soul from him. However, there was no need to worry about certain things, especially after I made a contract with the God of Wisdom. Our cooperation had reached a whole new level. Now that some things were laid out on the table, little Timlad's identity wasn't a big deal anymore. But after I learned about his identity, I found it rather strange that he didn't know anything about artificial souls. According to what I knew, in the largest ruin of the Halettim generation, there was a tombstone with the 3 major crimes of the Halettim generation inscribed on it. Of course, it wouldn't be wrong to call them results: the Halettim generation's immortality, artificial souls, and the creation of life. But now, little Timlad actually told me that their research on artificial souls hadn't been going well. This undoubtedly piqued my curiosity. Yep, it hasn't been going well. Actually, it's still a problem with the foundational nature of the soul. Apart from the creator goddesses, nobody is capable of creating the foundational nature of the soul. It's impossible to create a soul through pure calculation. If you want to create an artificial soul, activate it, and make it a living soul with all sorts of emotions and the possibility of evolution, you'll need to fuse more natural souls into it. That's obviously an evil idea. Isn't that the same as undead mages? using souls as materials to create new soul creations, playing around with souls and physical bodies. Wasn't that something only undead mages could do in the past? That's right. We worked so hard to create innovative technology, but it was actually left behind by someone else? That's basically an insult to the Heletum generation's technicians. But as far as I know, at least before the end of the Heletum generation, there shouldn't be any major improvements in this area. I nodded. I could barely count as an expert when it came to researching souls. I could also make some guesses about how the Heletum generation created artificial souls. From Timmy's words, it was obvious that their artificial souls used pure computing power to form logical abilities. But, just like the computers in other worlds, no matter how much computing power they accumulated, they still wouldn't be able to be called a complete human without a qualitative change. Now that you mention it, it's somewhat similar to the tower spirit. It can make logical deductions, but it doesn't have a sense of self or emotions. What do you mean similar? It's all a set of technique. Do you think those mages don't know how to rob graves? Pooh. I instantly laughed out loud. The image of a mage wearing a gold-rimmed monocle and wearing mage robes was instantly replaced by a simple and strong man carrying a shovel. Actually, many ancient techniques and magic spells were created in such a way. It wasn't wrong to say that mages were skilled at being unlucky. Some lucky thief, mountain dweller, or farmer would accidentally discover a ruin, and then the news would spread, causing the mages to flee faster than anything else. By the way, this place wasn't too far away from the mage country. Could it be that a mage organization had joined in as well? If that's all, it shouldn't be considered a taboo, right? As far as I could recall, the Heletum generation had been destroyed by a divine punishment. Since the Holy War was a periodic cleansing system, the gods were quite displeased with mortals. Normal suicidal behavior wouldn't be punished by a divine punishment. It's fine if it's just this technique, but the Heletum generation just happens to have invented artificial physical bodies and soul preservation technique. You know about the Sky Tower, right? Yep, the Sky Tower in the sea or something, right? That's actually a soul preservation center. There are countless small rooms in the tower that contain the brains and souls of the Heletum generation. The Heletum generation can still be researched there. It's just that they're waiting to be reborn. Reborn? I seem to have heard an interesting term. Timlad's explanation helped me understand just what the Heletum generation's great engineers had done back in the day. Unlike the mage's archaeological analysis of the Heletum generation, the Heletum generation's great engineers weren't idiots with no foresight. It was impossible for them to do something as foolish as make their entire population immortal. After all, anyone with even the slightest bit of foresight would know that there was a limit to how much the world could contain. However, the Heletum generation's actions were still quite excessive. They would evaluate the value of humans, and anyone who reached a certain threshold would be directly immortal. Everyone else would have to wait in line in the Sky Tower to be reborn. Their value would determine how long they could live and how long they could be reborn. The Heletum generation's population would increase or decrease based on society's need. With this method, the Heletum generation's expansion speed was indeed the same as the Heletum generation's population. However, there was something that the Heletum generation hadn't thought about. In that case, wouldn't it be the equivalent of all souls being imprisoned in the Sky Tower? The Heletum generation would only have newborns coming out of the cycle of reincarnation, but no dead people returning to the cycle of reincarnation. The Heletum generation's total number of souls would continuously increase, which would definitely destroy the balance of the world. The Chaos faction would never allow such a unified civilization to appear. The decrease in the number of dead would directly decrease the River Styx's resources, which would directly threaten the cycle of the lower planes. The Order faction's gods. How could those who pursued the truth possibly worship the gods? How could a restricted worldview allow one to discover the truth of the world? That's why the mages and engineers only showed respect to the gods. Similarly, the Halettum generation didn't believe in the gods. In fact, some even began researching the gods. There were those who captured the gods. There were those who believed that the gods died due to lack of belief. There were even quite a few gods who tried to steal the divine seat. Quite a few gods died because of this. I didn't need to say anything else. If people wanted to die, they would die. If they wanted to die to such an extent, they would simultaneously offend two major factions. This directly affected the foundational foundation of the Holy War, which also determined that the Halettum generation was destined to die. Back in the day, all 7 sky towers were destroyed. All the souls who believed that they had obtained immortality all entered the cycle of reincarnation at the same time. All records were lost. Even if the Halettum generation managed to survive the divine punishment, a fatal plague that targeted the entire species took away everyone's lives. The Halettum generation also met its end. Timlad's words sounded like he was sighing. However, he didn't feel much sorrow because he had personally experienced it. To him, he had only inherited the Halettum generation's knowledge and memories, not his own experiences. He was more sighing about how the Halettum generation's secrets and knowledge had been lost. There was no need to mention the past. However, if this was related to the future, it would be necessary to ask. Since Catalina had come from the ruins, there was definitely something strange about that place. So, you're saying that the artificial souls from back in the day were only similar to the Tower Spirit's technology, which required a large number of natural souls in order for the artificial souls to obtain a sense of self? Yes, but it's difficult to say for sure. After so many years, perhaps the technology has become even more complete. Right back in the day we also had Tower Spirit. The Mage Tower's Tower Spirits were named after our Sky Tower's Tower Spirit. They were the greatest masterpiece of artificial souls. Their calculation abilities were astonishing, and they were capable of independently managing the countless living creatures within the tower. Did they have a sense of self? No. That was strictly forbidden. First, in order to create an artificial soul with a sense of self and emotions, all other natural souls would have to be destroyed. The stronger the artificial soul, the more natural souls would be needed. That would be the equivalent of mass murder. And once the 7 star saints, that's how the 7 sky towers' tower spirits were called, obtained a sense of self, it would be impossible to say who would be ruling over who. I couldn't help but chuckle upon hearing this. As expected, it wasn't only Earth's humans who were worried about being killed off by their own artificial intelligence. Human nature was truly universal. This plot is so familiar. Is the next scene going to be the Skynet battle against the Terminators? Beep. The title of Jinxer has been activated. My system always made such senseless jokes, and I was getting tired of them. Now that I thought about it, those Jinxers were all my system's fault. I'm not joking. Back in the day, the Halettum generation had more than just the 7 sky towers. The 8th, which is the largest sky tower, is already quite close to you. What? How do you think Catalina came to be? Damn, why didn't you tell me something so important earlier? You didn't even ask, cough. I should say that you didn't meet the requirements to activate the quest. Just how many random things do you think I have in my memories? In the deepest part of a mountain valley, the ruins labeled Z8 had already begun operating. The Civilization Reconstruction Project was its name. In order to keep it a secret, those who weren't related to the project had no understanding of this sky tower. The Halettum generation didn't lack wise individuals. Those who were knowledgeable had already seen their fate of destruction, so of course they would make preparations. This sky tower would only be activated on its own 2,000 years after the other 7 sky tower spirits had all died. Due to certain reasons, the sky tower Z8's first awakening didn't go smoothly, and it soon fell into a deep slumber again. More than 10 years ago, a rash adventurer entered the ruins and took away an important component, allowing the entire sky tower to begin operating once more. This sky tower even extended underground. Originally, it should have been filled with the souls and brains of great engineers, elite workers, and soldiers. However, more than half of the sky tower's rooms were now completely empty. Meanwhile, in the deepest part of the underground, at the top of the Tower of Babel, in front of Z8's soul throne, a few black-robed mages were moaning in pain. Their skulls had been cracked open, and their exposed brains were exposed under the stimulation of electricity, revealing all of their secrets. However, the master of this sky tower ignored them. His gaze was now focused on the void, where a venerated guest was waiting for his invitation. Your Majesty, conservation, perhaps we already have a common goal. After a long while, there was a response from the void. At the very least, we now have a common enemy, those arrogant and hypocritical gods. Chapter 504. To tell you the truth, I keep feeling like there's something wrong with that scene, Why do you say that? Look, other protagonists are all so pretentious and face-slapping. Their basic style is completely different. I wouldn't be able to do that even if I had to, so I'm not envious of them. However, some developments are the same. At the very least, the main character will become more and more powerful. His status will become higher and higher, and he'll have more and more subordinates, more and more beautiful women. He'll become more and more powerful, and his reputation will become better and better. However, you're becoming weaker and weaker, and your status is almost non-existent. You're all alone now, and your subordinates have all run away. Beautiful women, cough, cough, at least you're becoming more and more like an antagonist boss. Yep, you're just short of a hero suddenly appearing and sending you back to your hometown. The silly cat's words seemed to be comforting, but they were actually filled with malice. However, they were quite appropriate in comparison to the current situation. I clenched my fists on the table, and my pitch-black cape covered my body and face. The only thing that was clear was probably the faintly burning shadow fire in my eyes. As a veteran undead mage, I was quite skilled at making others unable to understand me. On the second floor of this small and cramped house, an old oil lamp was the only source of illumination. The door was tightly shut, and the stuffy air and the smell of sweat made me feel quite uncomfortable. After all, there were more than 20 people crammed into this suffocating environment. Perhaps it was because the negative energy around me was far too overbearing. At the very least, there was no one around me. Only Timlad, who was barely wearing leather armor and looked like a barbarian, was standing behind me. On the other side, Diana, who was dressed as a dark elf assassin, wore a veil, but her exposed chin was icy cold. It was as if she didn't care about the people on the table at all. She simply sat by the wooden window, silently playing with the short sword in her hand as she looked outside. I feel like there's no need to waste any more words. You all know why I've gathered everyone here today. I've asked a master to appraise this treasure map, and it's real. However, those bastards are blocking our path to riches. If it were up to me, I'd just kill them all. The one who spoke was a rather tall, brawny man with a face full of gray beard. He seemed to be at least 60 or 70 years old, but he only had 3 fingers on his right hand. If he remembered correctly, he should be the leader of the local mercenaries and the vice president of the mercenary union, mongrel Tom Shull. He represented the will of the scattered mercenaries, and to his right, old Barton was drinking his wine with his head lowered. It seemed that he had indeed made a name for himself since Tom had brought him here. Mercenaries fought with their blades, mostly for the sake of money. It would be strange if they weren't tempted when they discovered that their hometown actually had such a large amount of wealth. And when these local tyrants banded together, it was only natural that only a veteran mercenary with a certain reputation could take charge. Before, old Barton had enough reputation, but his strength was still lacking. Since he was able to reach this position, he naturally displayed sufficient strength. The one who came is Prince Link, and your highness has royal guards with you. It wouldn't be good to clash with the royal guards, right? Peace brings wealth, peace brings wealth. He had a plump body, a friendly face, a rather comical beard, and a protruding belly. No matter if it was his appearance or his temperament, he was clearly a merchant. Actually, he was indeed a merchant. However, he was the famous black market merchant Blayman. He had several mercenary groups under his command, and his power level was no weaker than a knight leader's. Merchants were all quite careful. It was obvious that the people gathered here were all criminals who would risk their lives for money. There would be no end to the consequences of offending the royal family. They would be able to run away after causing trouble, but Blayman's business was all in the Sala dukedom. It was rather inconceivable that he would come here, but it was more understandable when I saw the person next to him. She was a woman. However, her entire body was covered in scars. Half of her face had been disfigured by a vicious sword wound. Only her bangs were intentionally covering half of her face. Not only that, she was covering the uninjured half of her face. She was basically intentionally trying to make everyone uncomfortable. This set of female armor seemed to be more for decoration than actual value. However, under the reflection of the light, one could see the unique orange-red color of enchanted adamantine. No matter what other abilities she had, being able to wear this set of armor meant that she was definitely strong enough to tear down walls with her bare hands. That was because this set of armor was at least as hard as 3 full sets of heavy armor. Blood Spear, Selima was an Amazon. She was a female Amazon warrior that was at least at the legend rank. She was also one of Marquis Tarek's most trusted countesses, as well as the highest-ranked female general here. Perhaps it was due to her ugly appearance, but her only exposed eye always had an icy glint that was as sharp as a blade. It was impossible for anyone to look directly at her. She didn't hide her hostility or guard at all. She was most famous for her bad habit of massacring people after every major battle. Those who hated her directly called her the Blood Witch. Since her appearance was far too unique and she was far too famous, there was no need for anyone to introduce her. Everyone else instinctively kept their distance from her. They're together. Has Brightman already joined the rebel army? He's in control of several nearby prefectures' food and weapons. It would seem that the royal family is going to have a hard time. It was quite normal for these two to come to such a conclusion when they were together. However, the fact that they were able to attract a major character like Selima here also proved the authenticity of the treasure. Of course, there were other people sitting at the table as well. Some were the leaders of veteran adventuring teams, while others were information merchants and bandit leaders. However, none of them were as important as these 3. Originally, I shouldn't have been the most important person here as well. After all, I wasn't famous in the past. But in this world, power would forever be the best calling card. It was just that I was wearing the slowly burning hellfire, which seemed dangerous but was actually even more dangerous. These people naturally stayed far away from me. Even Selima's single eye was somewhat wary of me. This was why I had the right to speak. This group of people had chosen a private house in the middle of the night to gather. Of course, it wasn't some kind of harmonious and friendly party. The only thing we were discussing was how to break through the imperial family's blockade. From a certain standpoint, this was no different from a rebellion. However, I was slightly surprised that I didn't see any representatives from the Death Council. Apart from me, not a single person here possessed the power of death. I didn't believe that they would miss out on such a good opportunity. Even if they couldn't come to an agreement, they could at least gather some information. But suddenly, Diana passed me a slip of paper from the side. There were several black runes on the paper that looked like scribbles. Allies in the ancient Leiden language? Who else would use such an ancient language? I was surprised for a moment, but then came to a sudden realization. The ancient Leiden language was the language of a species of demons in the lower planes. It had the connotation of corruption, and could be used in many high-level undead magic incantations. If it wasn't for the fact that someone specialized in undead magic and had to learn a high-level undead forbidden spell, they wouldn't have learned such a language. Before I could ask Diana who had sent the letter, I saw the fat old merchant intentionally touch the silver ring on his finger. It was an expensive dragon bone ring with black runes all over it. If the skull symbol wasn't enough to prove his identity, then the word, allies, written on his lips proved everything. It would seem that my efforts to have Shink contact the Death Council hadn't been in vain. My information had already been delivered. However, not only had the Death Council hidden themselves deeper than expected, they were even more cautious. This was both a contact and a small test. After all, my arrival was a bit too coincidental, so it was only natural that they would suspect something. I shot a questioning glance at Diana, and she nodded slightly. It would seem that the letter had been sent by this, always amiable merchant of death, Brightman. It was said that more than 70% of the Death Council's believers would eventually join the Death Council. They didn't do so for the sake of power or anything else, but rather because they feared death and desired immortality. There were quite a few wealthy merchants and officials among them. It was indeed true that the richer one was, the more they feared death. And so, I also wrote a few words in the ancient Leiden language on the letter. Death is fair, but sometimes sufficient wealth can buy the Hell God's special permission. Not long after the letter was taken away, an attendant whispered something into Brightman's ear, causing his old face to smile like the Buddha himself. I couldn't help but laugh. It would seem that he didn't understand the true meaning behind the letter. No matter what permission the Hell God gives, I'm afraid that it can only reach a certain level of the inferno of Hades. Our little actions didn't attract much attention. After all, most of the people here were doing the exact same thing. Breaking through the Royal Army's blockade would definitely mean that there would be people who would become the vanguard, cannon fodder. At such a time, if you didn't want to be a helpful warrior, then you would need more authority and allies. Forget about all the little notes flying around. The question, "Shall we go out?" would most likely be answered with a yes and an affirmative answer. Don't get the wrong idea. They were just having a private meeting after making an agreement. Although it was indeed quite frightening for two muscular men to repeat such a line, and even if we managed to break through the Sala government's blockade and had a chance to enter the ruins, we would need to use our own strength to fight for the treasures. It would naturally be a good idea to make a few more friends at such a time. However, there was still no progress on the issue on the negotiation table. We need a temporary leader, or at the very least, a liaison. That's a good idea. Why don't you take on the role? Me? I think that you're quite suitable. Everyone knew that we would need to break through the blockade in order to have a chance to reach the ruins. However, everyone also knew that going against the Sala royalty in the Sala dukedom would be an absolutely foolish idea. That would basically be cutting off any chance of making a living here, and it would definitely result in a wanted order. Perhaps other people wouldn't be blacklisted, but the leader would definitely attract great trouble. Everyone was looking at Countess Bloodspear. After all, her faction had a falling out with the royalty, so it was only natural that she would take action. However, Countess Bloodspear simply sat there quietly. She seemed completely different from her rumored irascible and warlike personality. However, if she maintained her current state, it would be obvious that she didn't want to take action. I yawned and even extinguished the ever-burning flame on my body. It would be a waste of time to continue having such a boring gathering. Originally, if it wasn't for the fact that the various factions were constantly fighting against each other, they would only be able to establish connections in the first alliance meeting. There would be a lot of wrangling afterwards. I was even considering whether or not I should find an excuse to escape. Suddenly, the door to the room opened, and a young man and an attendant walked in. Heh, everyone's here. Hello everyone, I'm Link. I'm the one you've been discussing about dealing with. Prince Link proudly walked in. He turned around in satisfaction to look at the retainer he had just taken in. This retainer who was born a commoner was indeed quite useful. He actually managed to so easily find out where all the rebels were hiding. Everyone at the table had expressions of astonishment. There were already hidden sentries set up everywhere, so how did this guy get in? Just obediently surrender. My army has already set up an inescapable trap. Prince Link swallowed the rest of his words. He had an expression of disbelief as he looked at the broken sword protruding from his chest. He suddenly turned around to see that the obedient knight retainer was currently smiling viciously. Actually, you've always been our target. Your subordinates? They won't come. Their orders were to patrol the city. This was the first time Blood Spear, Selima had spoken after so long. Unlike her frightening appearance, her mature and sexy voice stirred everyone's hearts. At this moment, those who were cowardly had almost fainted. Breaking through a city's defenses and murdering a member of a country's royal family were two completely different things. Everyone knew that they had been involved in an astonishing conspiracy. At this moment, Khan kicked away his lord's corpse and put away his sword, which was still stained with blood. He smiled viciously at everyone else. Boom. Suddenly, a violent explosion shook the entire city, and I heard the dragon Lich's slow soul voice in my ears. I have good news and bad news. Listen to the good news first. The good news is that there's no longer any meaning in blocking the way. We no longer need to worry about not being able to reach the ruins. The bad news: we don't need to go to the ruins anymore. They're here. The undead calamity is here. Chapter 505. What happened to exploring the ruins and flirting with pretty girls? Why did it suddenly turn into a war scene? How did the leisurely daily vacation become a troublesome business again? Watch. Don't look at me like that, it wasn't me. I swear that I didn't do anything this time, and I definitely wasn't the one who caused this. I'm not a jinx. I didn't set up any schemes either. I wasn't the only one with hidden sentries. Right now, many people were watching the mountain pass. Everyone would immediately know if there was any commotion there. The undead are here. There's a battle at the mountain pass. In the sky, there's a bone dragon in the sky. There's also a gargoyle, the vanguard of the undead army. The next moment, spies from all the factions reported that war was about to break out. Everyone paused in surprise when they saw Prince Link's corpse in the middle of the room. Perhaps it would be more accurate to say that they were dumbfounded. What's the royal army doing? Selima, who was the mastermind behind Marquis Tarek's faction, paused in surprise. Even though she was in cahoots with the Death Council, she was still a living person, and her goal was only the treasures in the ruins. As a living person, she would rather forget about the undead calamity. Ruins? What about the ruins? Knight Khan, who had just plotted to kill his new ruler, was also stunned. He had started out as a traitor, and had never had any sense of loyalty to begin with. Now that he had finally gotten rid of the evil prince who had threatened his treasures, he heard such news. This was the equivalent of cutting off his path to power. This was like a bolt from the blue. As expected of Brother Caro, I'll never be bored following you. Only Timlad seemed quite excited, as if he was quite satisfied with his daily life. I glared at him. This really wasn't my fault. I didn't have time to do anything yet. Wait, no, I really didn't intend on doing anything. When the horn of war sounded, the highest-ranked person in this small city was the second son of the Grand Duke, Link, who was a member of the royal family. However, he was now an ice-cold corpse, and the murderer was the only lord of this territory. The royal family's army was the strongest army in this territory, and they would follow the royal family's orders and fight to the last man. Against the murderer who killed the Grand Duke, even if there was still the undead army, the common enemy of the living, the distrust and bloodbath among the living was inevitable. Selima and I simultaneously looked towards Brightman. If this really was a scheme, then it was likely that only the undead and the Death Council would benefit from it. However, Brightman had a nervous expression as he stood up and kept waving his hand. This wasn't done by us. We don't know anything at all. If it was really done by us, we would have evacuated long ago. Crack! Us? Who are you talking about? Brightman, speak clearly. Amidst the chaos, I took a deep breath and lay down on the chair. I extended both my feet onto the table, and the dust kicked up by my boots caused the people around me to back off. What else was there to talk about? I had fallen into quite a pitiful trap this time, and I had even jumped into this trap of my own volition. This had nothing to do with me to begin with. I didn't believe that Brightman was lying. At the very least, the Death Council's goal had always been to bring sacrifices into the ruins in order to open the dimensional door to the Death Planes. They had paid a great price for this, but the dimensional door opened before the sacrifices even arrived. It was likely that something else had happened. The souls in the Sky Tower. Timlad's words helped me come to a sudden realization. The blood and flesh involved in the sacrificial ritual weren't actually the main point of the ritual. The souls that died in pain and filled with hatred were the true essence of the sacrificial ritual, as well as the energy source to open the dimensional door. And if the ruins were the Sky Tower, then there would already be enough souls. The remaining inferences were even simpler. Either the Death Council's believers left in the ruins opened the dimensional door to the Death Planes, or something had happened to the ruins itself. The size of the undead army? Since things had already come to this, there was no point in arguing about the reason. The most important thing right now was how to deal with the undead army. I can't even see the borders. There's at least 50,000 of them, probably 5 or 6 domain lords working together, or even one myth-ranked or higher undead. Right, there are also some undead that even I don't understand. If they aren't a new species that appeared in the last 300 years, then it's going to be quite interesting. A new species? Be more specific. Undead that even a dragon lich couldn't understand? This immediately piqued my interest. Those undead all have some strange metal components on their bodies. It's almost as if they were pieced together. I don't know their combat prowess yet, but their soul fire is inconceivably powerful. It's as if they're made up of hundreds of ordinary souls. You should also know that souls are the foundation of the undead. Right, their emotions are quite intense, just like living people. I didn't need to say anything else. The ruins had definitely changed. These undead creatures sounded like half-constructed, half-undead. Perhaps they were a new species. This was going to be quite interesting. Timlad, how many souls are there in the Sky Tower? How many? Back in the day, the entire civilization's dead were stored in the 7 towers. If those ruins were also the Sky Tower, there should be quite a few souls. Yep, if it really was a plan to revive the civilization as you said, then the minimum number of souls would be in the millions. If it were in the tens of millions, we would have been able to afford it. If I was the one who planned the revival of the civilization, it would even be possible to invest 20 million souls. Alright then, I really wanted to smash my head against the ground. If the number of souls required to open the dimensional door was in the tens of millions, then any type of undead would be able to pass through. It would seem that I would have to mentally prepare myself to face an undead emperor. Conservation? I also did some research on the undead emperor afterwards. It was either that this undead emperor was too low-key, or that my information on her was outdated. However, an undead emperor would definitely be difficult to deal with. An undead calamity with an undead emperor was completely different from an undead calamity without an undead emperor. No matter how intense an undead calamity was, it would only be a local battle. Meanwhile, an undead calamity could cause the entire country to collapse and be destroyed at any moment. Any undead emperor would be highly skilled at destroying the world and spreading death. I propose that Lady Selima be the temporary garrison general. She'll lead us through this crisis. I agree. I have no objections. The scouts had already delivered the information to them endlessly. No one in the room was an idiot. Fighting for power at this time was the height of stupidity. Naturally, Bloodspear, who had experience in leading troops, was elected as the temporary leader. Can we retreat now? The moment the undead army's scale was announced, some people were already wavering. However, none of the people at the table responded. This wasn't because they had any sense of honor, but rather because they might not be able to truly escape in this plain area. This was the only path to the ruins to begin with. If they lost this path, they would die even faster. Want to escape? Sure, they could have a powerful person guard this place and stall for as much time as possible. That way, everyone else could take this opportunity to escape. However, if this involved a battle between the living and the undead, any deserter's reputation would be ruined. And with such a powerful enemy in front of them, even if they were thinking of a way out, they couldn't say such a thing out loud. In that case, I'll be the temporary commander then. Since all of you want me to be the leader, I'll say this first. The current situation is no longer a simple civil war in Sasa. Ever since the Dawn Era, the undead calamity has destroyed more than 1 or 2 countries. Even if you can run, how far can you run? If you want to escape now, don't let me see you. Otherwise, I'll kill you without mercy. His single eye was filled with undisguised murderous intent. It was a gaze that thirsted for blood. His declaration that he would definitely kill them was no joke. Since I'm the leader, then I'll only say 3 things. First, that idiot killed Link. He's an undead spy, and he has nothing to do with anyone else here. The moment he said this, everyone else heaved a sigh of relief. As long as he was certain, many things would be easier to explain. Bitch, you're betraying. Khan was stunned for a moment. Before he could say anything, the dagger behind him was already aimed at his back. Even if he was a quasi-legendary level knight, he wouldn't be able to react in time when he was being attacked by 2 top-notch assassins. Just as he wanted to resist, his knee went numb, and he half knelt. Bastards! You're all burning bridges after crossing the river. But just as he cursed and tried to stand up, 2 legend-rank assassins took control of his arms. Suddenly, there was a flash of silver light. This was a short silver arrow that came out of nowhere. It directly pierced through Khan's throat, causing him to swallow all of his last words. Impossible! Khan's eyes were filled with confusion. He couldn't believe that his life had already come to an end before his mission of reviving his family had even begun. At this moment, Khan's face was filled with astonishment and disbelief as he covered the short arrow in his throat. He finally saw a black figure standing on the roof outside the window. That dark ranger was currently laughing maniacally at me. Apart from the burning hatred in his single eye, there was even more joy and fanaticism from getting his revenge. The glory and status that he had obtained through betrayal had also come to an end because of betrayal. All of his schemes and ambitions had become nothing more than bubbles. Shink was the last person he saw with his eyes open. The traitor had died because of betrayal, and the avenger had gotten what he wanted. Now that my soul connection with Shink was further recognized by the contract, everyone around me looked at me with much more caution. Would you believe me if I told you that this was just an accident? Alright then, they all knew that Shink was one of my people. Perhaps, in their eyes, Diana had been keeping watch outside the window, but she had actually opened the window to prepare for an ambush. As for who she was preparing to deal with, at the very least, it definitely wasn't Shink before. Now that there was no need to forcefully make a move, it would be a display of strength. Perhaps it would be to forcefully seize power. The power of imagination was limitless. They definitely wouldn't believe me if I told them the truth, but right now, I directly told Salima. Actually, I'm just on vacation. Don't worry about me. Alright, I have no objections to Lady Bloodspear assuming leadership. Please continue making arrangements. Time is precious. She glanced over but didn't say anything. She also knew that now wasn't the time for more problems to arise. The second part is that the situation isn't as bad as everyone thinks. Within a week, the royal family's reinforcements will arrive here. The one requesting reinforcements is Link. They've brought royal mages, night knights, and great engineers with them. Originally, they were here to reinforce the blockade here, or even to build a fortress. I never expected that those reinforcements would actually become our reinforcements. Many gazes turned towards the corpse in the middle of the floor. Who would have thought that this guy would actually do something good before dying? The last part? Selima's single eye was filled with undisguised killing intent as she looked around. We don't have time to slowly deal with the traitor. We need to eliminate the unstable elements in the city, those damned evil cultists from the Death Council. They might open the city gates at any moment. Haha, well said, yep. Diana, why are you pushing me? Why is everyone looking at me? Just as I was about to respond loudly to ease the tension, I looked down and discovered that my black robe was rather eye-catching. It seemed that my identity as a necromancer that I'd always proclaimed was a huge problem. Wait a moment, this isn't right. I'm not from the Death Council. He's the disciple of a legend-ranked Lich, the leader of the Death Council. I have evidence here. A heart-wrenching scream came from Brad. The undead calamity didn't care if you were from the Death Council or not. That arms merchant was already half scared out of his wits. The so-called evidence was the slip of paper with the Ride ancient language written on it. F***CK, can you not screw me over like this? Chapter 506. Did I shoot myself in the foot? I was already used to it. Did I set up so many traps, only to fall into my trap? I was already numb to all this. I had originally thought that my luck would improve after I reincarnated, but it would seem that I had been overthinking things. Is this fate? System, could it be that I'm really the legendary Luck E? Karma calculations are incredibly complex. The more things are involved, the more difficult it is to calculate. If you calculate it based on the fate and karma you're involved with, then you definitely aren't the so-called Luck E, you're Luck Z. Oh, there's no one in this world who's more unlucky than me? It's not unlucky. It's the ability to cause trouble. When considering the karmic connections that are involved with creating Hades, you've probably become a bug in the world's operations. That's why it's absolutely true that there's no one more jinx than you. In that case, you really weren't trying to scam me when you tricked me and gave me those little quests that made me speechless. Fine, I get it now. You just wanted to find an excuse to laugh at me. It seemed that I had mysteriously obtained the passive ability of being a main character. I would cause trouble wherever I went. Unfortunately, I didn't have the treatment of a main character. I couldn't casually obtain beautiful women who would throw themselves at me, nor could I casually walk into a room and open a treasure chest filled with divine weapons. What awaited me was only the miraculous luck of catching a killer whale on a fishing trip, or the miraculous luck of walking to the battlefields during a vacation. Was it really funny? Well, that was probably the case for outsiders. At the very least, the silly cat was already rolling on the ground in laughter. She took out her notebook and jotted it down. But the scene in front of me really made it difficult for me to laugh. There were powerful enemies outside, and the city itself was divided into several factions. Even though I had nothing to do with this, I was still being treated as a thorn in the side of others. I've had enough. I lay down on the table and acted as if I was a dead pig that wasn't afraid of boiling water. You've had enough? Wonderful, then let's flip the table. I just so happened to want to find a few battlefields to test out my new weapon. Damn, where did this Terminator come from? I turned around and was startled. His eyes were flashing with a blue light, and on his back was a 2-meter-long combination cannon. On his shoulder was a small magic crystal cannon, and on his muscular arms were 4 to 5 strange instruments. All kinds of data were flowing at high speed on the display screen. The ammunition belt on his waist was already full, and there were even 2 small machine cannons beside his feet. As for the others, I could barely understand them. What did the atomic energy symbol on the shoulder cannon mean? What exactly happened in this world? Could it be that the legendary mushroom egg was finally born? Are you really going to save the world? Your technology tree is completely crooked. What happened all these years? How did you turn a little Shota into a Terminator? My words caused Timlad, who was full of fighting spirit, to deflate. Please don't mention anything about falling in love with an older sister again. It's all because I was young and immature. Please don't use this as something you can use against me for the rest of your life. My title of Big Sister Lover has become the most resounding title, and even those bastards from the Gentlemen's Alliance are using it as a substitute title. It's all your fault. Then is your older sister married? How is that possible? Who dares to touch my older sister? Heh, I'll send them on a space rocket. Don't misunderstand. I'm really not an older sister complex. I have a girlfriend. Although she looks quite similar to my older sister, I really didn't look for her on purpose. Although I like her face the most, that's not why I'm pursuing her. Timlad, who had just been laughing evilly, suddenly reacted. However, he discovered that all our gazes were focused on him. The more he spoke, the more he tried to cover up. I had an expression of helplessness. This child was far too honest. The silly cat covered her face with her paws. This child was so honest that he didn't even have the face to see anyone. Ew, the system typed out an exclamation mark for the number of words used. Actually, punctuation marks didn't count, so she wouldn't be able to trick anything. While we were bored, the hostile crowd seemed to have surrounded us. Timlad's sudden appearance of heavy armor made everyone even more vigilant. But on the other hand, our indifference actually made these people more vigilant. After all, being calm was something only the strong could do. What? Pretentious? That was possible, but they usually wouldn't live for too long. Perhaps this can prove that we're on the same side. I reached out with my right hand, and pure holy light gathered into a ball. The next moment, it transformed into a shining silver cross. Let me introduce myself again. I'm the legend-ranked Holy Knight Caro. My mission this time was to hunt down those bastards from the Death Council. These undead magic spells are all special effects created by Duong. I received information that these bastards intended to open the dimensional door to the undead planes, so I disguised myself as an undead mage and joined them. However, before I could even enter, the undead arrived. My mission this time can be considered a complete failure. The pure holy light had an incredibly good reputation. The Holy Knight's reputation was truly trustworthy. My words caused everyone to relax slightly. Not only that, I also had a trump card that they trusted. I had always been well prepared when I was out in the world. Look, this is my identification, as well as my military achievement medal. Harmful Books Fan Club membership card? Eating King achievement medal? Sorry, I took the wrong one. I remember that I left it nearby. It would seem that I needed to clear out my dimensional bag. My random identification had piled up into a mountain. I suddenly tossed it out, and it actually piled up into a small mountain. Draconic Language Level 8 Certificate? I haven't seen it since I graduated. Simple Draconic Language is quite easy to learn, so there's no need to take the Level 8 exam at all. According to what they said, it's common for dragons to be able to speak the human language. Back in the day, I almost died trying to obtain this certificate, but it's basically useless after I graduated. The black certificate with the dragon's head emblem seemed quite amazing, but now that I thought about it, it was probably just a scheme of the Cloud Tower's Draconic Language training classes. They used a seemingly high-class name to attract people to spend money, but in the end, they learned some useless words and ancient grammar that had been eliminated by time. In the end, they could only use it to fill dimensional bags after they graduated. Which one? Everyone seemed to have been frightened by my mountain of trash as they took 2 steps back. But since time was of the essence, they didn't have the time to waste with me. Nutrition Certificate, Undead Mage Certificate, Level 2 Priest Certificate, Contract Hero Certificate, Oak Defense Battle Honor Certificate, Lawyer Certificate, Self-Defense Guard Certificate, 300-year-old Archmage Certificate, 10 times the Ultimate Virgin Certificate, Bone Cooking Certificate. I really should have cleared them out earlier. By the way, did I find something that shouldn't be in this world just now? Cough, cough. Don't misunderstand, it wasn't a bug. It was just my system making fun of me. Finally, I found my thin white Holy Knight certificate, to save money, and iron skin Holy Knight medal, to save money. Enough, I believe you. Apart from Holy Knight, no other job class would use such a certificate and medal. Actually, your Holy Light is proof enough. It's best if you use something to frame your certificate. It's almost rotten, so you should pay more attention to your identity. This was the result of having a 1,000-year-old shop. But it was also thanks to me that I had suppressed the date of the certificate's issuance. Otherwise, if the certificate was issued more than 300 years ago, people would likely suspect my sincerity in faking it. However, our ruckus helped to ease the tense atmosphere. The bloody Countess glared at me. She didn't have any hostility, but she couldn't hide her surprise and astonishment. There was even a tinge of fear and longing in her eyes. For her to feel such complicated emotions, it seemed that she had probably guessed who I was. After all, even though many people had attempted to fuse holy light and death magic after a certain incident, it was likely that only a few had succeeded. As long as one could tell that this death magic was real, it was only natural for them to have guesses. However, there might be other reasons for her to be able to make such a quick decision. Don't doubt my judgment. After the incident with the Hades, my racial talent, Stare of the Hell God, evolved yet again. Now my eyes were capable of directly seeing through souls. Even some emotional fluctuations wouldn't be able to hide from me. Lies would be meaningless against me. This was also why I was able to instantly see through Catalina's true nature. From a certain standpoint, I was the one who benefited the most from the destruction of hell. And my greatest benefit was actually my completed soul. The strengthening of my soul helped my physical body evolve even further. The evolution of my various species' natural talents was only the most inconspicuous of all the benefits I gained from the destruction of hell. So what if you can see through soul fluctuations and emotions? A good pair of eyes is for a coward. If you have the ability, look in the mirror and ask yourself which girl you intend to choose. Running away isn't a solution. Just how much do you owe her already? This emotional color, purple with a tinge of red, with some anticipation and some displeasure, is this the legendary Tsundra? Do you want me to look at her or not? It seems to me that you're hoping that I won't choose her. Didn't you volunteer to help me escape back in the day? My words were far too direct, and I immediately regretted them. What happened next was quite awkward. Neither of us knew what to say anymore. Cough, cough, Brother Roland, be more serious. We're at war right now. Fortunately, Timlad still remembered that we were at war right now, so he reminded us that business was more important. Since there was no problem with my identity, everyone else had long since gotten busy with their own matters. Some were sending messages, some were sending out scouts, and some were sending out scouts. I only had 2 or 3 subordinates under my command, so I just stood there and watched. It wasn't that I didn't want to do anything. After the incident with the Hades, I obtained some recognition, and was blacklisted by many factions and organizations. If any enemy discovered that I was here, they would probably set aside their mission of destroying entire countries and cities. Their top priority would be to kill me. That would be the same as actively escalating the battlefield, which would be far too foolish. I wanted to say a few more useless words, but suddenly, a powerful wave of elemental energy stole all of my attention. An unfamiliar undead emperor? No, it's Zero, a Zero who's much stronger than before. I could see a gigantic black soul pillar in the middle of the mountain range. This pillar reached all the way into the sky, and its pressure was even faintly stronger than Asso's. Without a doubt, an undead emperor had descended. We were in for a big laugh. Although I could see it, everyone else was still busy with their own matters. It was obvious that they didn't have sharp senses. Cough, cough, I have good news and bad news. Which one do you choose? Everyone's attention was focused on me, so I smiled in delight. As expected, whenever I was in a bad mood and had trouble, I would always find someone to share it with. The good news is that we don't need to worry about not being able to find the leader of the undead army. I've already found her, so our plan to decapitate her is completely feasible. Fighting a war of attrition against an undead army would always be foolish. Decapitation would be the only choice in most situations. It was obviously good news to be able to find an undead lord or sovereign that we could deal with. Seeing the joy in everyone's eyes, I felt even happier. The bad news is that the enemy is an undead emperor. That's right, you didn't hear wrong. An undead emperor is at the peak of the undead plane. She's at the myth rank and she's undefeatable. She's here with half of the undead plane's army. We don't need to worry about any deserters among us, because it's impossible for them to escape. It'll be the same no matter where they escape to. Hey, don't have such a sad expression. Cheer up. We've already found her. At the very least, we won't be completely unprepared when facing an undead emperor's ambush. Can you stop causing trouble? Are you so unhappy that you can't see someone getting unlucky? Chapter 507. A cold wind with a putrid stench blew against us. Dark clouds gathered in the sky, and the drizzling rain didn't seem romantic at all. The muddy ground and damp weather would only increase stamina consumption, which was obviously beneficial to the undead who didn't know fatigue. The target is about to reach the second line of defense. Has everyone retreated? How many people are left in the first line of defense? There are still 2 squads who can't retreat in time. We've done our best. May the holy light protect them. How's the second line of defense? It's not good. The temporary defensive barrier can only buy us some time. Numerous battle reports came in like scraps of paper. It was the same every time a war suddenly broke out. There was little good news and a lot bad news. Among all the bad news, there was probably one good thing that Link did before he died. He brought over 3,000 soldiers from the giant rock heavy infantry with him. Normally, that would be 3 brigades of elite heavy infantry. They were divided into 3 squads to seal off the entrance of the canyon. They even set up scouting outposts and patrolled the area. When the undead arrived, the outposts and patrol routes that they set up inside the canyon became the first line of defense. However, nobody expected them to be able to defend the canyon. When Selima took command, she didn't ignore these gold-ranked warriors who were originally enemies. Instead, she sent out reinforcements in hopes that they would retreat as quickly as possible. After all, every bit of strength belongs to the living. As long as we can save them, we'll do anything to save them. The vice-commander of the giant rock heavy infantry, Shan, was a giant with barbarian bloodline. Currently, he was helplessly listening to the commands of his enemy. The moment that the undead emperor descended, the civil war in the Solid Dukedom became meaningless. In the face of the undead calamity, there was no difference between loyalty to the royal family and loyalty to Marquis Tarek. After all, they were all fighting for the living. Shan wasn't an idiot. He knew that if he returned like this, just the assassination of Prince Link would cause the royal family to vent their anger on him. Right now, the only way to survive was to make as many contributions as possible on the battlefield. Of course, the prerequisite for this was that the living had to win this war. Otherwise, the Solid Dukedom would be destroyed, and there would be no need for revenge. In my opinion, Blood Spear, Selima had a terrible reputation due to her record of massacring entire cities. However, looking at the current situation, she was indeed capable. At the very least, she was ruthless and was willing to pay a heavy price. The ruins were located in the mountains and valleys. If the undead wanted to come out, they would have to go through a rather long mountain road. So, she sent out a suicide squad to blow up parts of the mountain road and set up many defensive lines to stop the undead from advancing. An army's marching speed was determined by the slowest soldier type. The regular undead army with skeletons wasn't fast, and with the addition of mountain roads and slippery rain, their speed was even slower. A landslide, as well as a landslide caused by man-made explosions, was an excellent weapon for delaying an army's advance. The undead army's natural disadvantage made it so that they were moving slower and slower, and against the undead's patrolling Bone Dragon Knights and Death Knight generals, even if they were lucky enough to successfully complete the task of blowing up the mountain path, these warriors who were tasked with delaying the undead would never be able to return. In Starwood City's temporary command center, Sulima only sent out her own subordinates in order to achieve as much consensus as possible, as well as to avoid wasting time at such a critical moment. Do your best to save an ally who was once my mortal enemy, and prioritize sacrificing loyal personal guards. Although this sounded noble, it was actually quite foolish in terms of military strategy. However, in a temporary alliance that didn't trust each other, this was quite a commendable style. At the very least, Sulima now had the image of a fair and trustworthy leader. Perhaps this wouldn't be very effective in uniting the living, who were already filled with conflicts, but it was still much better than the leader of the allied army who fell into a trap, and a bastard who sent others to their deaths. At the very least, it would reduce the possibility of internal strife. Did Sulima have any famous generals before? She didn't. How could she possibly have a general who was a local domain lord in a small country? What, you think she's quite good? Perhaps she'll have one in the future. That's right, I had high hopes for this little blood spear. It seemed that others were underestimating her. To be honest, even I wasn't confident that I could do better than her. At the very least, I was unable to send out my personal guard. I gave them vague missions that would only serve as cannon fodder to stall for time. If I really had to choose between my friends and my enemies to make a necessary sacrifice, I would unhesitatingly allow my friends to survive, even if they were the minority. I was no saint, and I would never deny that I had a selfish side. But I was getting off topic. So many sacrifices were only for the sake of stalling for time. And time on the battlefield would forever be a priceless treasure. Being able to instantly make such a decision meant that Sulima's abilities as a general were already above average. Hurry up, hurry up! Are there no more earth element mages? Scrolls or wands are fine. Reinforce the city walls for me. Adventurers, don't be stingy. No matter how much money you have, you'll need to be alive to earn it. Keep a tab on the wall sculpting scrolls you use. The Solid Dukedom's officials have already agreed to reimburse you. The sturdiness and height of the city walls would be the defenders' lives. Although earth element mages were the most common of the 4 major elemental mages, they had already used up all their mana in constructing the city walls. Left with no other choice, we didn't even spare the random adventurers' scrolls and wands. Scrolls and wands were used one after another. The earth around Starwood City was dug up, and the newly constructed city walls were piled higher and higher. Fire mages baked the city walls in the rain, reinforcing them for the second time. Boom. That idiot who's using fireballs to heat up the city walls, throw him out. We're already in a situation like this, and he's still causing trouble for us. It was a rookie mage who had used a fireball to dry the mud. However, the fireball blasted a huge hole in the mud, and he himself became a mudman. Although I could understand Noob's ability to twist orders, I could probably give a thumbs up and praise the idea of slowly baking a small fire into a large one. However, the others wouldn't be so good-tempered. The 12th section of the southern city walls has been reinforced. Next up is that one. A young magic swordsman pulled out his gray magic sword. The magic sword that had just been stabbed into the ground had already lost its luster. He immediately swapped it for a spare Olivia's magic box before heading to the next section. The most eye-catching members of the city wall repair team were probably the 4 elemental swordcasters. Although they weren't very skilled at controlling the elements, they were still capable of manipulating the earth to form walls. Not only that, the heavy infantry also had magically powered weapons and equipment, so they had an almost limitless amount of mana to reinforce the city walls. Of course, when considering the upcoming battle, the Boulder Rock Heavy Infantry Squad didn't use up too many logistical resources. They were hurriedly preparing their armor, replenishing their food, and adjusting their weapons in preparation for battle. Cold rain fell on these muscular men's faces, but their movements didn't change at all. Only such cold and emotionless soldiers were the most trustworthy. In the upcoming battle, they would definitely become the main force. As professional soldiers and the protectors of this country, it was impossible for them to retreat. And their companions who had already sacrificed their lives yet still refused to retreat made me re-evaluate the actual combat strength of this unknown army. News of the undead army had already spread. However, in order to avoid shaking the army's morale, the news of an undead emperor in the undead calamity didn't spread. After all, not everyone had the courage to face such dire straits. With such a calamity looming over our heads, many adventurers responded to the government's summons by taking out their magic scrolls and staffs and accepting the government's orders. Unfortunately, Earth-type magic scrolls to reinforce the city walls were rarely used in adventuring. The task of reinforcing the city walls still fell on the shoulders of the 4 elemental swordcasters. Not only that, the 4 elemental swordcasters were also able to display their abilities in more and more complicated situations, which made them more and more popular. Tisk, they're only reimbursing wall sculpting scrolls? A 3-circle scroll is ridiculously cheap. How thoughtful of them. Are they trying to prevent people from lying about high-level scrolls in order to take advantage of the situation? At such a critical juncture, only you would do such a thing. Hey, why are you so shameless? Are you really intending to lie about your expenses at such a time? Do you have any shame at all? Even the villains aren't as ridiculous as you. You're the villain of epic heroes. Humph, what a pity. If my Earth Archmage classmate Cade was here, these low-level scrolls wouldn't even be needed. He could directly perform the miracle of constructing a city in one night. It's a pity that he's not here. Hey, you're trying to change the topic. Do you really want to scam money and profit off of a country's calamity? Can't you at least have some self-awareness as a positive character? Starwood City was the only way to block off this mountain path. If Starwood City was broken through, there would be endless plains where there would no longer be any natural defenses to stop the undead army from invading. And once the undead army split up and spread out on the plains, massacring the undead and replenishing their numbers, the undead calamity would snowball and increase exponentially in number. Selima's judgment was absolutely correct. It would be meaningless for us to run anywhere in the plains. Reinforcing this small city and blocking off the undead army while waiting for reinforcements from other cities was definitely the only choice we could make. Have you introduced the background yet? Are you trying to steal my mission? Do you really not want to answer my question about scamming money that much? Even if you want to scam money, you should at least do something high class. At the very least, create a stock market disaster or something so that they'll remember it for 10 years. Why are you scamming money for drinks? Don't be like someone who's worked for more than 10 years and finally got promoted to a department head. You're so excited to use your family's taxi tickets to show off to the company as a special benefit. I can't say any more. You're so pitiful and embarrassing. Of course, Selima's choice is correct, but whether or not she can do it is another matter. Based on my many years of experience of being scammed, not to mention an undead emperor, Even any famous undead lord wouldn't be able to handle it. Yep, that's assuming nothing unexpected happens. Are you pretending you didn't hear me? Forget it, say whatever you want. I ignored my system's sarcasm and pretended not to see the silly cat's evil smile. Meanwhile, I couldn't stand the cold as I stood on the city walls, so I pulled my cloak tighter around me. This battle was truly going to be difficult to fight. Yep, we were currently dealing with serious matters. Let's just pretend that we didn't see any of those trivial matters. I didn't even need to mention how troublesome undead emperors were. Although undead emperors were only at the semi-god level in name, using this as a standard, I and Ale could be called undead emperors when I was at my peak. However, it wouldn't be too difficult for us to kill off weaker true gods when we were at our peak. Everyone above myth rank would be semi-gods, and the power levels in the mortal plane would be ridiculous. This reinforced city wall is more of a psychological effect, that's right. Although they seemed to be doing their best, I didn't have high hopes for them at all. The Bone Dragon Knight vanguards circling beneath the dark clouds had already announced that we had lost control of the air. A tremendous amount of undead would easily fill in the newly dug trenches. The reinforced city walls would be unable to stop a full-powered charge from Bone Giants and Death Knight. Not to mention, there was also an undead emperor. An undead emperor was basically a strategic nuclear weapon. Who knew what she would do? I agreed with Selima's judgment. Strategically speaking, defending Starwood City to the death was the only solution. However, I didn't have high hopes for Selima's efforts, as the tremendous difference in combat strength would be difficult to make up for. It would seem that I still have to personally act. I feel that Zero will probably be quite excited to see me. Perhaps the battle will directly escalate. Even if she doesn't see you, doesn't that mean it's not an all-out battle? Just look, doesn't this look like a field trip? The silly cat, who was taking a nap on my shoulder, opened her eyes. What she saw in her eyes was a desolate gray mountain range. Countless undead were slowly advancing. There were ghouls, gargoyles, zombie warriors, skeleton archers, banshees, abominations, and all sorts of famous undead. The legend-ranked undead winter demons that I had met that night were also among them. However, no matter how many undead there were, the Black Army remained silent and resolute. Only the sounds of skeletons moving could be heard. For an undead army, this could only mean that there were many mid-level and low-level commanders capable of controlling every single noisy skeleton. An undead calamity of this level would be far more difficult to deal with than I had expected. The next instant, a white bone arrow shot towards me, instantly destroying the silly cat's clone. That was the end of our information sharing. We didn't even know where that arrow had come from. Damn it, don't you know that battlefield reporters have the right to travel safely? Although many of them are part-time spies, and many die mysteriously every year. My nonsense didn't help the atmosphere at all. The silly cat had an ugly expression as she faced such an undead lord. Of course, it was also possible that her face had turned pale from anger after her clone was destroyed. There aren't as many low-level undead as there are mid-level undead. This undead army hasn't reached its limit yet. As long as they have enough corpses, their numbers can instantly increase by 10 times, no, 100 times, 1,000 times. Obviously, using precious soul sacrifices in exchange for low-level undead's permission to enter the mortal plane wasn't worth it at all. Only the elites would be able to enter the mortal plane. As for cannon fodder, the undead army never had to worry about a lack of soldiers. They only needed to fight 1 or 2 battles. Seeing such an army, I was no longer worried about whether or not Selima would be able to defend this small city. Instead, I was worried about whether or not Selima would be able to survive the first wave of undead attack. And this kind of situation made me decide to take the initiative to interfere. Since we've already entered the realm of war, let the war begin. Let the undead become the enemies of the undead. Awaken, my leader of the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. While I was doing my best to protect my image, the silly cat who had already changed job class to a spiteful servant appeared again. 4 horsemen? You have 3 other creations of the same level? When did you make them? Why don't I know? Heh, of course you don't know. That's my top secret. Stop biting me. Can't you act cool in this day and age? You'd be cool if you had the 4 heavenly kings as your subordinate. Look, the word war doesn't sound cool at all. How cool would the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse be? How cool would that be? Perhaps one day, I'd really create another plague night, death night, and famine night to make up the 4 heavenly kings. At that time, when we meet an enemy army, all 4 horsemen will be riding on top of a mountain and looking down on the enemy. They'll be able to strike fear into the enemy's hearts without even fighting. That'll make the enemy feel so much like an antagonist boss. How cool would that be? Stop talking, you jinx. I already have an ominous premonition. According to your usual style, you'll never become a cool knight. You'll only become a perverted gentleman with no morals. Everyone needs to have dreams, even if those dreams are destined to never come true. You already know that you won't be able to come true, so why are you still struggling? There's no such thing as miracles. As an African who only knows how to be unlucky, you should just calmly go hunting with your spear. Chapter 508. What you say is quite good, but it's meaningless. Perhaps an impassioned idealist's speech would receive applause, but when that idealist's dreams collided with those with vested interests, cruel reality and actual violence would tell him that the truth would always be within the reach of his fist. Was there no one who wished to make this cruel world a little better? Was there no intelligent person who discovered the path of truth to save the world? That was impossible. However, those who were good at scheming would usually be physically weak. In this cruel world, the word of truth wouldn't be able to make it far without the support of strength. I need power. In order to be able to be reasonable, I need more power than those who do as they please. I knew that no matter how beautiful my words were, they would never be able to move those hungry wolves. That was why I desired for the light of law to illuminate the entire world. It wasn't because it was superior or because it represented some advanced culture. It was because in this cruel world, law could give mortals more power. I seek the path of protection for the weak. I seek the sword of judgment for the pure to slay the evil. I hope for the light to illuminate the land, even if some people are destined to live in the shadows. Since this world was destined to be one where the strong preyed on the weak, then I would allow mortals to become strong individuals who could control their own fates. Only when I truly walked down this path did I discover that there were far too many seniors on this path. Some of them had been strangled to death by their own ideals, some had lost their beliefs, and some were still persisting in confusion. They were all searching for the nearly impossible path of salvation. There were many ruins of civilization and countless people who had given up hope. Perhaps they were mortals who overestimated themselves in the eyes of the gods, but in my eyes, they symbolized that heroes were being passed down from generation to generation. There had never been a lack of foolish people who angrily roared at the heavens. Why won't you give us a path of survival? Perhaps some people would think that I was amazing. After all, most of these major events that were destined to be recorded in history were planned by me. But I knew that I was just lucky. I just happened to meet someone who could help me realize my ideals. Without Estrada, the holy light wouldn't be able to receive salvation. Estrada was actually just one of the countless holy knight who followed the path of protection. Only when that silver war hammer landed in my hand did I realize how heavy it was. If the original holy knight who protected humanity in the wilderness was the origin of the past, then Estrada was nothing more than a vessel. On the plains of despair, the holy knight who walked into the crowd were the true nameless heroes. Perhaps it was impossible for them to defeat the gods, but their furious roars and resistance against the god of holy light signified that the holy light had entered a new life. I bear the path of holy light, I swear to protect the weak. I swear to expel the darkness. I swear to do good for the rest of my life. I swear to protect and fight for mortals. From that moment on, the dawn of a new era truly began. The Holy Light Knight who broke free from the gods' restraints would use their own hearts to protect the Holy Light. That was the future of the Holy Knight. And the Holy Knight who died on the plains of Bardi were the true heroes who broke the path of Holy Light and created a new future. Now, on the plains of Bardi, even though monuments to the Holy Light weren't allowed to be erected, the mortals who experienced the Holy Light's events still kept repeating the roars of those heroes, even if they didn't even have names. The Holy Knight's sacrifice was only an ordinary member of the Holy Light's generation. Ale had sacrificed himself for eternity and shattered the cycle of reincarnation. Orlos had seen through everything, yet he had to bear the stigma of being a foolish king. Without the sacrifices of those who shared the same path, what would my fantasies amount to? The ones who truly made my inconceivable fantasies become reality were those who sought the path of salvation. Among them were the gods, demons, devils, but even more than that, ordinary mortals. All they desired was to survive in this damned world. We just want to survive. Why is it so difficult? Dear H.E., don't you love us? Why do you have parents? When the despairing masses finally gave up on asking the gods for help, when they decided to sacrifice everything so that their children wouldn't be stabbed into the spears of bloodthirsty villains, how could the seeds of resistance possibly be extinguished? My seniors' sacrifices weren't for nothing. When that invisible flag was erected, there were ancient first-generation humans, survivors from the Haletum generation, princesses from the kingdom of the elves, heroes and sages from human kingdoms, evil dragons and dark elves from the underground cities, and princes from destroyed countries. Inconceivable? Actually, it sounded nice to call them seniors, but according to how they mocked themselves, it was actually those who should have died long ago but are still struggling at death's door and making a fool of themselves. The irony was that when this generation's cycle of reincarnation was broken, the ones who made the greatest sacrifice and worked the hardest were us who had already lost our homes, inheritances, families, countries, and even our own civilization. We did everything we could so that our descendants wouldn't have to walk down our path again. We shared our experiences with other destroyed countries and species in order to prevent the misfortune of having a destroyed country from descending upon us again. And our final conclusion was quite laughable: don't be afraid, face them head-on. That's right, in the face of despair, so-called persuasion and morality were all fake. It would be the most foolish of all to hope that the high and mighty existences would truly have so-called compassion. True combat power was the only way to solve all problems. No matter what we intended to do, we would still have to fight against the two major factions in the end. The battle to establish the Hades was a direct confrontation against the two major factions, and we won. We actually won. Cynthia died? Our hard work seemed to have been realized? Our mission had ended? How laughable. Just look at this world. At least 170 countries are currently at war. Countless invaders and ambitious individuals are currently wantonly trampling over the lives and souls of mortals. Everything is over just like that? Is this the peace that you've been hoping for? That's right, the price we paid was to avoid the inevitable despair of death. It was still unknown whether or not we would be able to survive this cruel final holy war. Every holy war in the past had ended in near total annihilation. None of the holy wars had the despair of the creator goddesses awakening, but the final holy war was still incredibly tragic. And this final holy war meant that all accumulated conflicts and historical legacies would explode at the same time. Since every species desired the one and only crown, this final holy war would definitely be incredibly brutal. There would definitely be no so-called victor. Our hell now has 4 pillar gods: holy light, law, death, and ice. Mortals will obtain new power. When law truly protects every mortal, and when mortals become the strongest, perhaps a relatively long period of peace will descend. Mortals will also learn to communicate in peace. However, growing stronger will require time, and our enemies won't give us such time. If we can't get past what's right in front of us, then everything will be empty talk. Don't be a coward. Face them head on. Come on, no matter who your opponent is, no matter how strong you are, come on, since you think that strength is the only truth, then let me, a dead leftover, reason with you. Then, I'll show you how many teeth this old dog still has. A cold, putrid wind blew towards us. Behind us was a town of the living that was urgently being reinforced, while in front of us was an endless army of undead. Meanwhile, on our side, there was only a single person standing atop a gigantic horseman of the apocalypse. This was a battle of 1 against 10,000, but it was fated that the strong would bully the weak. Come, weaklings who fear death. Welcome your true, eternal slumber. Come, allow Grandpa Yongye to teach you the rules of being a ghost. When the silent undead army blew their horns to charge, I felt that my boredom for fighting had finally ended. The holy war, that would end everything, had finally begun.